Pharaoh Ramesses II and his daughters. Ramesses II ruled Egypt for 66 years, fathered over 100 children, and built monuments so enormous they still dominate the Nile landscape 3,000 years later. He also married at least two of his own biological daughters, elevated them to the rank of great royal wife, and had those marriages inscribed on temple walls for eternity. The daughters in question were Bintenath and Meriteten, though some Egyptologists note the Meriteten connection requires further untangling from the Amarna period figure of the same name. What is clearly documented at Abu Simbel and elsewhere is that Bintenath bore Ramesses a child, meaning he was simultaneously that child's father and grandfather. What makes this particularly striking is that none of it was hidden. There was no scandal, no hushed palace rumor. It was state policy, carved in stone, presented as evidence of divine favor. The reasoning was theological as much as political. Pharaohs were not considered ordinary humans. They were living gods, direct manifestations of Horus on earth. And in Egyptian mythology, the gods themselves practiced exactly this kind of union. Osiris married his sister Isis. The divine bloodline was understood to be a separate category of existence from the human one, and mixing it with lesser blood was seen as dilution rather than preservation. Keeping power and divine essence concentrated within the smallest possible circle was framed not as transgression, but as sacred responsibility. Across the ancient world simultaneously, in Greece, in Mesopotamia, in the early Hebrew kingdoms, these same acts were treated as among the most serious violations imaginable. Egypt looked at the same behavior and put it on a temple. That contrast alone tells you something significant about how completely royal power can reshape the definition of normal. Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty was done with Egypt, the original pharaonic tradition of dynastic marriage looked almost restrained by comparison. The Ptolemies were Greeks who had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, and they took the concept of keeping power within the family to extremes that would have unsettled even Ramesses. Cleopatra II married her brother Ptolemy VI first, which was standard Ptolemaic practice. When Ptolemy VI died, she then married her other brother, Ptolemy VIII, a man Roman sources nicknamed Physcon, meaning potbelly, which gives you some sense of how history remembers him. Ptolemy VIII was already in a complicated political entanglement with Cleopatra II's own daughter, Cleopatra III, whom he also eventually married, meaning he was simultaneously the husband of a mother and her daughter. The domestic situation was, to put it mildly, unstable. The conflict between Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra II eventually escalated into open civil war, with Cleopatra II driving him out of Alexandria entirely and ruling Egypt alone for a period. His response, when he regained power, was one of the most calculated acts of personal cruelty in ancient history. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, whose account historians note may carry some hostile bias, but is considered broadly credible, Ptolemy VIII had his own son by Cleopatra II, a boy named Memphites, murdered and dismembered. He then had the pieces packaged and delivered to Cleopatra II as a birthday gift. She was meant to open it during her celebrations. Despite this, and despite everything that preceded and followed it, the three of them, Ptolemy VIII, Cleopatra II, and Cleopatra III, eventually reached a political settlement and were listed jointly on official Egyptian documents as co-rulers. History records them sharing a throne. It does not record how any of them felt about sharing a dinner table. Emperor Claudius and Agrippina the Younger. The Roman Empire produced a remarkable number of catastrophic marriages, but the union of Emperor Claudius and his niece Agrippina the Younger in 49 AD stands apart because of how precisely deliberate it was and how spectacularly it backfired. Agrippina was the daughter of Germanicus, making her Claudius's own niece, a degree of relation that Roman law explicitly prohibited as the basis for marriage. Claudius solved this problem the way emperors solve inconvenient problems. He changed the law. A formal senatorial decree was passed, making uncle-niece marriage legal in Rome, specifically and transparently to facilitate this one union. Tacitus, writing in the Annals, describes the public reaction as somewhere between discomfort and open disgust, noting that this particular configuration was seen as quasi-incestuous even by Roman standards, which is a significant bar to clear. Agrippina's motivations were entirely transparent to everyone, including presumably Claudius. She was the most politically capable woman in Rome, had a son from a previous marriage named Nero, and wanted him on the imperial throne. Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, who was the natural heir. Marrying Claudius gave Agrippina the leverage to have Nero formally adopted and moved ahead in the succession. Then, In October of 54 AD, Claudius died after eating mushrooms at dinner. Ancient sources, including Tacitus and Suetonius, state plainly that Agrippina poisoned him, likely using a species of amanita prepared by a woman named Locusta, who was essentially a professional poisoner maintained by the imperial court. Historians debate the certainty of this, and it is possible Claudius simply died of illness. But the timing and the outcome aligned so perfectly with Agrippina's interests that ancient and modern observers alike have found coincidence difficult to accept. The result of the marriage was the reign of Nero, who eventually had Agrippina herself executed in 59 AD, completing one of history's more complete cycles of dynastic destruction. Isabella of Valois and Richard II of England. Richard II of England was 29 years old and needed a peace treaty with France. The French king had a daughter named Isabella, who was, at the time of their marriage in November 1396, 6 years old. The wedding took place at Calais, a piece of English-controlled French territory that served as neutral ground, and it was conducted with full royal ceremony, elaborate ritual, and the complete diplomatic gravity appropriate to a treaty between two major European powers. Isabella of Valois, born on the 9th of November 1389, became Queen of England, while she was still at an age when most children are learning to write. By most historical accounts, Richard treated her with genuine kindness and did not attempt to consummate the marriage, instead raising her more as a ward within the royal household while they waited for her to come of age. This is sometimes presented as evidence that the arrangement was not as troubling as it appears, but that framing requires accepting a fairly low baseline. The marriage was not about Isabella's well-being. It was a diplomatic instrument, and she was the instrument. When Richard was deposed in 1399 and died in captivity in early 1400, most likely starved to death at Pontefract Castle, Isabella was 10 years old and already a widow. She was returned to France having spent 4 years as an English queen. The French then arranged her second marriage to Charles, Duke of Orleans, when she was 17. She died in childbirth at 19. Her entire life, from the age of 6 onward, was defined by her value as a political object, passed between crowns like a letter of credit. Her own preferences at no point a recorded consideration. Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian I. On the 5th of January, 1477, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, died in battle at Nancy, leaving his 20-year-old daughter Mary as the heir to one of the wealthiest territories in Europe. Within days, the political vultures arrived. Louis XI of France immediately invaded Burgundian lands, hoping to absorb the territory and force a French marriage on Mary before she could arrange her own. The Holy Roman Emperor moved. The Spanish crown made inquiries. Every major European power understood instantly that whoever married Mary of Burgundy would inherit enormous wealth, strategic territory, and a claim over the Low Countries. Mary herself understood this too, but her ability to act was constrained by something more immediate than foreign armies. The city of Ghent, where she was effectively residing, held her in a state of political captivity. The Flemish cities demanded sweeping concessions of their own rights before they would support any marriage arrangement, and to demonstrate how serious they were, they arrested 2 of Mary's most trusted advisors. Hugo van der Goes's patrons, Pierre Hugonet and Guy de Brumeux, tried them on charges that most historians consider pretextual and executed them publicly in front of her. She had to watch. She then signed the document they wanted. Mary chose Maximilian of Habsburg, a match that would reshape European history, and they married in August 1477. By most accounts, the marriage was a genuine partnership, unusual for the era, but Mary died in March 1482 at 25, thrown from her horse during a hunting accident, leaving Maximilian as regent over territories and children that were not originally his and a Habsburg dynasty positioned to dominate Europe for the next 2 centuries. The marriage that built an empire lasted less than 5 years and began with a woman watching her advisors executed while armies closed in on her borders. Juana of Castile and Philip the Handsome. Philip of Habsburg was called the Handsome, and, by contemporary accounts, the name was earned. He was charming, politically capable, and comprehensively unfaithful, conducting affairs throughout his marriage with a casualness that was not unusual for European royalty of the period, but that had a particular and devastating effect on his wife. Juana of Castile was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, heiress to the most powerful throne in Europe, and she was, by every account, from people who knew her, deeply and desperately in love with Philip in a way that went far beyond what the political calculus of their marriage required. When Philip died suddenly, on the 25th of September, 1506, at the age of 28, possibly from typhoid fever, though poison has never been entirely ruled out by historians, Juana's grief became the mechanism of her destruction. Contemporary and later accounts describe her refusing to allow his coffin to be sealed, traveling with it across Castile, and on at least some occasions opening it. The precise details of this period are contested, and some historians argue the most lurid accounts were exaggerated or invented by those who had political reasons to paint her as mad. What is not contested is what followed. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, declared her unfit to rule on the grounds of mental instability. When Ferdinand died and her son Charles inherited, Charles confirmed the arrangement. Juana spent the last 46 years of her life imprisoned at the castle of Tordesillas, classified as incapable of governing, while remaining the nominal Queen of Castile throughout. She died in 1555 at approximately 75 years old. Whether she was genuinely mentally ill or whether grief and inconvenience were weaponized to remove a woman from power she was legally entitled to hold is a question historians are still actively debating. The marriage that produced the most powerful ruler in Europe also produced one of its longest and most quietly horrifying political imprisonments. Henry VIII and Catherine Howard. Henry VIII's fifth marriage is the one that sits most uncomfortably, even by Tudor standards, which is a remarkably high bar. Catherine Howard was somewhere between 16 and 19 years old when she married the 49-year-old king in July 1540. Though her exact birth year is genuinely unknown, with estimates ranging from approximately 1523 to 1527. Henry, by this point, was a man in serious physical decline. His jousting injury had become a chronically infected leg wound that contemporaries described as producing a severe smell. His weight had expanded dramatically, his waist reportedly reaching extraordinary dimensions by his final years. Catherine's own history before the marriage was one of exploitation rather than romance. From around the age of 13, she had been in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was minimal and older men had access. Her music teacher, Henry Manox, began a sexual relationship with her when she was approximately that age. A man named Francis Derham followed. Both relationships happened to a girl who had no meaningful ability to refuse adults in positions of authority over her. When she became queen, Thomas Culpeper, a court favorite and a man with a documented history of violence against women, became involved with her. The exact nature of that involvement remains debated, but the outcome was not. Culpeper and Derham were both executed. Catherine was beheaded on the Tower of London on the 13th of February, 1542, almost certainly still a teenager. The night before her execution, she reportedly asked for the execution block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head correctly. This detail, which appears in later accounts, and should be treated with some caution as to its precise accuracy, has endured because it captures something true about her situation, regardless of its literal veracity. A girl, practicing for her own death, in a tower, trying to get it right. Mary Queen of Scots and Lord Bothwell. By 1567, Mary Queen of Scots had already lived enough for several lifetimes. Her first husband, the King of France, had died young. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a vain and politically useless man whom she had grown to despise, and who had participated in the murder of her secretary David Rizzio in front of her while she was pregnant. Then, on the night of the 10th of February 1567, the house where Darnley was staying in Edinburgh, a place called Kirko Field, was destroyed by an explosion. Darnley's body was found in the garden. He had not died in the blast. The evidence strongly suggests he was strangled before the explosion was set, which means the explosion was staged to conceal a murder. James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, was immediately and widely suspected. He was powerful, ambitious, and had the means and the motive. In April 1567, Bothwell abducted Mary while she was traveling, taking her to Dunbar Castle. What happened there is described differently depending on the source, but Mary's subsequent actions, specifically her agreement to marry Bothwell, were interpreted by most of her contemporaries and by many historians since as the result of coercion. Some historians argue she may have been complicit in Darnley's murder, and that the abduction was partly theater. The truth is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is the outcome. They married on the 15th of May, 1567. The Scottish nobility revolted almost immediately. Mary was captured, imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, and forced to abdicate. She miscarried twins during her imprisonment. Bothwell fled to Scandinavia, was captured by the Danes, and spent the remaining decade of his life chained in Dragsholm Castle, reportedly descending into madness. Mary escaped, fled to England, hoping for Elizabeth I's protection, and spent the next 18 years imprisoned before being executed on the 8th of February, 1587. The marriage lasted 3 months and destroyed both of them completely. The Habsburg inbreeding peak. The House of Habsburg did not have a family tree. They had a family circle, and they walked around it for 200 years. The deliberate policy of marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, and dynastically recycling the same bloodlines across generations was understood at the time as a method of keeping power consolidated and bloodlines pure. What it actually produced was one of the most well-documented cases of the biological consequences of inbreeding in recorded history. A study published in 2019 by researchers including Alvarez and colleagues analyzed the genealogical records of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and calculated that by the time of Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg king, his inbreeding coefficient had reached approximately 0.254. To understand what that number means, the coefficient for a child born to two full siblings would be 0.25. Charles II was more inbred than that. The results were visible and devastating. Charles II suffered from what contemporaries and modern medical historians identify as a collection of conditions consistent with severe inbreeding. The pronounced mandibular prognathism, known as the Habsburg jaw, was so extreme in his case that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, making chewing nearly impossible. He was reportedly unable to speak clearly due to the size of his tongue. He suffered from epilepsy, was impotent, and was described by contemporaries as physically and mentally fragile throughout his short life of 38 years. He died in 1700 without an heir, ending the Spanish Habsburg line entirely and triggering the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped Europe. The dynasty's obsession with blood purity had, across 2 centuries of deliberate marriages, systematically dismantled the very bloodline it was trying to protect. Philip II had married his own niece, Anna of Austria, in 1570. Their descendants kept compressing the circle. Each generation made the same calculation. Each generation handed a slightly worse set of consequences to the next. Charles II was the final invoice. Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon Bonaparte divorced Joséphine de Beauharnais on the 15th of December, 1809, in a formal ceremony at which both of them reportedly wept. He was 40 years old, and at the height of his power. She was 46 and could not give him a child. The divorce was strategic, and it was devastating, and Napoleon appears to have experienced it as both simultaneously. He then set about selecting a new wife with the same methodical efficiency he applied to military campaigns. He considered a Russian princess. He considered various other candidates. He settled on Marie-Louise of Austria, the 18-year-old daughter of Emperor Francis I, the man whose armies Napoleon had defeated at Austerlitz and Wagram, whose empire Napoleon had humiliated, whose capital Vienna Napoleon had occupied twice. Marie-Louise had been raised in the Austrian imperial court to understand Napoleon as a monster, a Corsican tyrant, the destroyer of European civilization. According to accounts of her pre-marriage preparation, she had to be specifically reassured that he was not physically deformed before she could bring herself to accept the match. She had no meaningful alternative. The marriage took place on the 2nd of April 1810. Marie-Louise bore Napoleon a son, Napoleon II, on March 20, 1811, securing the heir he had divorced Josephine to obtain. By most accounts, she adjusted to the marriage more successfully than anyone had expected, reportedly developing genuine affection for Napoleon. Then the empire collapsed. When Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814, Marie-Louise did not follow him. She returned to Austria, was given the Duchy of Parma to govern, and eventually took a new partner and a second marriage. Napoleon spent his final years on St. Helena. Their son, given the title King of Rome and later Duke of Reichstadt, died in Vienna in 1832 at the age of 21, having never ruled anything. The heir for whom an empress was divorced and an empire arranged a dynastic marriage never sat on a throne. King Leopold II of Belgium and Marie Henriette of Austria. Leopold II and Marie Henriette of Austria married on the 22nd of August 1853, and by most historical accounts, they were spectacularly mismatched from the first day. She was energetic, warm, fond of horses, and possessed of a straightforward personality that fit poorly with the cold, calculating, secretive man she had been assigned to. Leopold was already, even as a young man, obsessed with the acquisition of a colonial territory he could control personally, independent of the Belgian parliament that constrained his domestic power. Marie Henriette reportedly described her marriage as a prison. She eventually relocated to the spa town of Spa in Belgium and lived separately from Leopold for a significant portion of their marriage, a separation that became effectively permanent. Leopold poured his energy into the Congo through a campaign of deliberate international deception conducted at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. He persuaded European powers and the United States that his proposed Congo Free State would be a humanitarian project, a free trade zone that would bring civilization to Central Africa. What he built instead was a slave state operated for the extraction of rubber and ivory, enforced through systematic mutilation and murder. Estimates of the death toll vary significantly among historians, with figures ranging from 1 million to 10 million Congolese people killed through direct violence, starvation, and disease during Leopold's personal rule from 1885 to 1908. Marie Henriette died in 1902, still technically his wife, having spent decades in effective separation from a man whose private activities constituted one of the worst atrocities of the 19th century. Leopold spent his final years with a young mistress, Blanche Delacroix, whom he met when she was reportedly around 16 years old and he was in his 60s. He died in 1909, having surrendered the Congo to the Belgian state the previous year under international pressure and reportedly having burned the administrative archives to prevent documentation of what had been done there. Emperor Hirohito and the imperial marriage system. Hirohito's marriage to Nagako Kuni in January 1924 began with a government committee debating her genetics. A faction within the imperial court had discovered, or claimed to have discovered, that Nagako carried a gene associated with color blindness, and on this basis, they moved to block the engagement and substitute a different bride. The objection had nothing to do with Nagako's character, her intelligence, or her preparation for the role of empress. It was a biological audit, conducted on a young woman who had already been selected and who had been preparing for this marriage since she was a child. The resulting political crisis was severe enough that Nagako's father, Prince Kuniyoshi Kuni, threatened to commit ritual suicide if the engagement was broken, a declaration that escalated the situation beyond what the opposing faction could manage. The matchmakers, who had raised the genetic objection, were forced to resign, and the marriage proceeded. Once married, Nagako faced pressure of a different kind. She bore 4 daughters in succession, and the imperial court's anxiety about a male heir became a sustained atmosphere of institutional expectation that contemporaries described as suffocating. Advisors reportedly raised the possibility of Hirohito taking concubines from the traditional imperial concubine system that still technically existed, a suggestion he refused, a decision that was treated at the time as evidence of remarkable personal virtue rather than what it would be considered in any other context, the bare minimum of basic decency. Crown Prince Akihito was finally born on the 23rd of December, 1933, nearly a decade into the marriage. Hirohito's reign encompassed Japan's transformation from divine empire to defeated nation to constitutional monarchy, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals, American occupation, and eventually a position as a respected constitutional figurehead. He and Nagako remained married until her death in June 2000, at the age of 97. What makes the marriage disturbing is not what happened between them, but the system that surrounded it, one in which a woman's chromosomes were debated by government officials. Her reproductive output was a matter of state emergency managed by committee, and the entire framework of her existence within the marriage was determined by her biological utility to an institution that considered itself divine. Egyptian royal sibling marriages. Pharaohs were living gods, and gods do not marry commoners. That was the theological logic behind one of the most jarring royal wedding traditions in all of human history, the systematic marriage of brothers to sisters, uncles to nieces, and fathers to daughters across thousands of years of Egyptian dynastic rule. This wasn't a rare scandal or a desperate political compromise. It was policy repeated across dynasty after dynasty, so normalized that Egyptian religious arts celebrated it openly by pointing to the divine marriage of Osiris and his sister Isis as the template royal couples were simply following. If the gods did it, the pharaoh did it. The reasoning was airtight by the standards of a civilization that genuinely believed its ruler was a deity walking the earth in human form. Allowing divine blood to mix with ordinary bloodlines would have been, in their framework, a kind of theological contamination. The most famous example is Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, who formally married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, when he was approximately 10 years old, and she was around 18, according to historians of the period. When that marriage ended badly, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile after a civil war between siblings. Cleopatra married her next younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, and continued ruling. These were not love matches, and by most historical accounts were not treated as genuine marriages in the personal sense, but legally and ceremonially they were the real thing, complete with the full weight of Egyptian and religious ritual. What makes this tradition so strange in retrospect is precisely how unremarkable it seemed at the time. There were no recorded public scandals about it, no priests refusing to perform the ceremonies, no courtiers raising objections. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which began with one of Alexander the Great's generals and ruled Egypt from 305 BC to 30 BC, actually imported the tradition after observing how deeply embedded it was in Egyptian culture, adopting it despite coming from a Macedonian Greek background, where such marriages would have been far less accepted. Modern analysis of royal mummies from various dynasties has identified skeletal and physiological markers consistent with inherited conditions that accumulate over generations of close-kin marriage, though attributing specific conditions to specific marriages remains contested among Egyptologists. The wedding ceremonies themselves would have been lavish affairs. Gold and lapis lazuli, walls carved with hieroglyphs, priests in white linen, the air thick with incense, completely indistinguishable in their grandeur from any other royal marriage. The only difference was who stood across from the pharaoh at the altar. The Chinese imperial crying ritual. In imperial China, a bride who arrived at her wedding dry-eyed was considered a disgrace. Not mildly unusual, an actual social failing that reflected poorly on her entire family and suggested she was cold, ungrateful, or poorly raised. The tradition of ritualized pre-wedding weeping, most extensively documented among the Tujia ethnic group, but reflected in broader aristocratic and noble wedding culture during the Ming and Qing dynasties, required brides to begin crying approximately 1 month before the wedding day, and to continue crying for hours each day until the ceremony itself. This was not private grief. It was a structured communal performative act with its own internal choreography. The bride began crying alone in her chamber, lamenting the life she was leaving behind. Within days, her mother would join her. Then grandmothers, aunts, elder sisters, until eventually the entire female household was engaged in coordinated weeping sessions that could last for hours. There were actual songs composed for this purpose, called, in rough translation, crying marriage songs, with lyrics detailing the sorrow of leaving one's girlhood home, the uncertainty of life in a new household, and gratitude mixed with grief toward parents who had raised her. The songs had verses, structure, and specific emotional beats that skilled criers were expected to hit convincingly. A bride who cried beautifully was praised. A bride who cried badly, or who couldn't produce convincing tears, risked her reputation before the marriage even began. The social logic, once you understand the context, is not entirely alien. In a world where young women were transferred from one household to another through arranged marriages with little personal agency, public weeping was one of the few sanctioned ways to express real emotion. It also functioned as a kind of character display for the groom's family. A bride who wept copiously for her parents was demonstrating that she was loving, loyal, and emotionally deep, qualities that would presumably transfer to her new household. The contrast with the wedding day itself was striking. The ceremony was loud, red, and celebratory. Firecrackers and silk, and the color of good fortune everywhere, while the weeks before had been built around an almost theatrical performance of sadness. Both were required. The crying and the celebration were considered two halves of the same complete ritual, and skipping either would have been considered deeply improper. The bedding ceremony. For most of medieval and early modern European history, a royal marriage was not legally complete until it had been consummated, and the nobility was not willing to simply take the couple's word for it. The bedding ceremony was the solution, and it was exactly what it sounds like. After the wedding feast, which could last for hours, involving enormous quantities of food, wine, music, and dancing, the guests, the clergy, and members of the court would form a procession and escort the newlyweds directly to their bedchamber. The priest would bless the bed and its occupants. The witnesses would remain in or immediately outside the room, and the marriage would be confirmed. The legal stakes could not have been higher. For royal families, an unconsummated marriage was a marriage that could be annulled, which meant no legitimate heirs, which meant disputed successions, which meant wars. The entire point of most royal marriages was to produce children who would inherit thrones and cement alliances between kingdoms. And if there was any ambiguity about whether the union had been properly completed, the political consequences could be catastrophic. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540 is one of the most documented examples of what happened when consummation became contested. Henry claimed the marriage had not been consummated and used that claim as partial grounds for annulment just 6 months after the wedding, a process that required testimony about deeply intimate details from members of the royal household. The bedding ceremony existed precisely to prevent that kind of dispute. If 100 witnesses watched the couple get into the blessed bed together, there was very little room for later argument. For the couples themselves, frequently teenagers in politically arranged matches who were meeting each other for the first time only days before the ceremony. This was simply the reality of royal life. Privacy was not a concept that medieval royalty could reasonably expect, and the bedchamber was as public a space as the throne room when the dynasty needed something confirmed. The tradition began fading through the 16th and 17th centuries as Protestant reformations changed the legal and theological requirements around marriage, and as emerging ideas about domestic privacy slowly shifted what was considered appropriate for witnesses to observe. But for several centuries, having an audience at the most intimate moment of a wedding night was not a violation of privacy. It was the law. Mary, Queen of Scots, wore white mourning. On April 24, 1558, Mary, Queen of Scots walked into Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris to marry Francis, the Crown Prince of France, wearing white. The French court was startled, and not because white was unusual for a queen. It was because white was the traditional color of royal mourning in France. Wearing it to a wedding was, by the conventions of the time, deeply strange, the chromatic equivalent of showing up to a celebration dressed for a funeral. Mary reportedly wore it anyway, because it was her favorite color, a choice that carries a certain audacious quality when you consider that she was 16 years old, already Queen of Scotland, and conducting one of the most politically significant royal weddings of the 16th century in front of the assembled French nobility. The marriage united the Scottish and French crowns and positioned Mary as a potential claimant to the English throne, a fact that made Queen Elizabeth I deeply uncomfortable across the Channel. The ceremony at Notre Dame would have been spectacular in every architectural sense. The cathedral's vast stone interior, the golden light of hundreds of candles, the assembled grandeur of the French court, and at the center of it, a teenage queen in white, surrounded by the red and gold of French royal ceremony, standing out in a way that was either brilliantly unconventional or a spectacular diplomatic misstep, depending on which courtier you asked. Francis himself was 14, sickly, and would be dead within 2 years of the wedding, making the choice of mourning white feel, in retrospect, grimly appropriate, though no one could have predicted that at the time, and it would be unfair to read the future backward into Mary's choice of dress. The fashion legacy is genuinely contested. Some historians have argued that Mary's white wedding gown planted a seed that eventually grew into the modern Western tradition of brides wearing white, but this connection is speculative and the evidence is thin. The far better documented influence on the white wedding dress tradition is Queen Victoria, who wore white to her 1840 wedding to Prince Albert, and whose choice was explicitly covered in the press and widely imitated across Britain, and eventually the world. Mary's white gown is historically fascinating, but its direct influence on later fashion is more romantic legend than established fact. The proxy wedding. A royal proxy wedding was a fully legal, completely binding marriage ceremony in which the groom was not present. Not late, not delayed, not attending via some earlier version of remote communication, simply absent, sometimes by thousands of miles, while a legally appointed stand-in spoke his vows on his behalf, received the ring, and in some documented cases, went through the symbolic formality of lying next to the bride on a ceremonial bed with a sword placed between them to indicate the unconsummated status of the union. The marriage was real, the groom was elsewhere. This arrangement was not considered particularly strange by the standards of early modern European diplomacy because the alternative, waiting months or years for political and military circumstances to align well enough for two royals to occupy the same location at the same time, was operationally impossible at the scale of empires. Napoleon Bonaparte used a proxy wedding on March 11, 1810, to marry Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon was in Paris. Marie-Louise was in Vienna. Archduke Charles of Austria stood in as Napoleon's proxy at the Viennese ceremony, speaking the emperor's vows on his behalf in front of the Austrian court, while Napoleon simultaneously presided over a reception in Paris celebrating a marriage that was happening, at that exact moment, without him. Marie-Louise then made the weeks-long journey from Vienna to France to finally meet the man she was already legally married to. Marie Antoinette went through a similar process decades earlier, undergoing a proxy ceremony in Vienna before traveling to France to meet Louis XVI, crossing the border at Strasbourg, in a ritual that required her to formally hand over everything she had brought from Austria, clothes, her dog, even her attendants, before being dressed entirely in French garments to symbolize her complete transfer into the French royal household. She was 15. The proxy system created genuinely peculiar legal edge cases that courts actually debated. If the proxy groom died during the ceremony, was the marriage valid? What if the real groom died before the bride arrived? These were not hypothetical questions. They were practical legal problems that European courts of law had to address, because the proxy wedding had created real marriages between people who had never met, conducted by people who were not actually the parties involved, and the consequences of any ambiguity rippled outward through succession law, inheritance, and international diplomacy. Peter the Great's dwarf wedding. In 1710, Peter the Great organized a royal wedding in St. Petersburg. He gathered guests from across the empire, arranged a church procession, prepared a feast, hired musicians, had costumes made, and invited the full Russian court to attend. The wedding couple and approximately 72 of their guests were dwarfs, gathered by imperial collectors sent across Russia specifically for the occasion, dressed in miniature versions of full royal court regalia. Peter himself attended, towering over the proceedings. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, and by all contemporaneous accounts, this was not a secret, embarrassing event held quietly in a back room. It was a full court occasion, documented by foreign ambassadors in their official dispatches back to their home governments, staged with the same organizational resources that Peter applied to building his new European-style capital city and reforming the Russian military. The context is important for understanding just how strange this actually was, even by the standards of the time. Peter the Great was simultaneously one of the most radical modernizers in Russian history, forcing his nobles to shave their beards, importing Western European experts in shipbuilding and engineering, constructing St. Petersburg almost from nothing as a window to the West, and a man who organized what amounted to a grotesque theatrical spectacle using human beings as props for court entertainment. The two things coexisted without apparent contradiction in Peter's court. Elaborate human spectacle had a long history in European royal entertainment, and Peter was not uniquely cruel by the standards of absolute monarchs, but the dwarf wedding stands out because of its sheer organizational scale. Finding 72 people across an enormous empire, transporting them to the capital, outfitting them in custom clothing, and staging the event as a deliberate parody of the royal wedding format. The actual couple at the center of it. The names of the bride and groom appear in some historical accounts but are not consistently documented. Across sources, were real people with no apparent say in whether they wanted their wedding turned into the most elaborately staged entertainment event of the Russian court season, the blackening of the bride. Somewhere in Scotland, probably within the last decade, a woman was ambushed by her closest friends and family members a few days before her wedding, held down, and covered from head to foot in a mixture of soot ash, spoiled food, raw eggs, fish guts, treacle, flour, and feathers. The more disgusting the combination, the better, before being paraded through her town on the back of a truck while onlookers cheered and threw additional material at her. This was not a crime. It was a wedding tradition, and it is one of the few entries on this list that is not purely historical. The blackening of the bride, most extensively documented in Aberdeenshire and Fife, but practiced across much of rural Scotland, has roots that ethnographers trace back at least to the 19th century, and probably much further into pre-Christian folk practice, though the precise origins are genuinely uncertain. The stated purpose of the ritual has two main explanations, and both were probably true simultaneously at various points in the tradition's history. The first is preparatory. If the bride could survive complete public humiliation, being made to look and smell as repulsive as possible while strangers stared and laughed, then she was proven tough enough to handle the challenges of married life. It was a resilience test delivered through organized chaos. The second explanation is apotropaic. The disgusting smell and appearance would ward off evil spirits who might otherwise curse the marriage. A bride who smelled like rotten fish and looked like she had been dragged through a coal mine was not an attractive target for supernatural interference. What makes the tradition particularly vivid is the contrast it creates. The blackening happens days before the wedding, and then the wedding day itself arrives. Clean dress, flowers, the full ceremonial weight of the occasion. And the bride who was publicly humiliated a few days prior now stands at the altar as though none of it happened. The two events are separated by a sharp line, and crossing that line is part of the point. The groom version of the tradition is a more recent development, likely emerging through the 20th century as the ritual evolved with changing gender dynamics. And in contemporary Scotland, it has become something close to a competitive event, with groups trying to outdo previous blackenings in sheer volume and variety of disgusting material used. The shoe game. The transfer of a bride from her father's household to her husband's was, across a remarkable number of cultures spanning from Scandinavia to the Slavic world to Anglo-Saxon England, symbolized by a shoe, specifically, by the father removing one of the bride's shoes and handing it to the groom as a formal act during the wedding ceremony. In Russian and broader Slavic wedding tradition, This moment carried the full legal and ceremonial weight of a property transfer because that is precisely what it was understood to be. The father was formally relinquishing guardianship and authority over his daughter, and the groom was formally accepting it. The shoe was the object that made the exchange visible and official in front of the assembled witnesses. Following the handover, the groom would, according to ethnographic accounts of the tradition, lightly tap the bride on the shoulder or back with the shoe, a symbolic gesture, not a violent one, establishing his new role as the head of her household. The bride would bow or kneel at this point, completing the visual grammar of the ceremony for everyone watching. Some regional variants of the tradition included a small gift or coin hidden inside the shoe by the father, a blessing concealed within the instrument of transfer, a final private gesture from one household to the next. What makes this tradition particularly interesting historically is how widely it appeared across cultures with no direct contact with each other. The Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, documented in written codes from early medieval England, included a nearly identical practice. A father would hand his daughter's shoe to the groom, who would tap her on the head with it as a symbol of his new authority. The parallel between that practice and the Russian version is close enough that historians have suggested both are drawing on a shared ancient Indo-European cultural inheritance in which the shoe functioned as a consistent symbol of legal authority and household transfer across a wide geographic range. The Russian Orthodox Church, which absorbed and formalized many pre-Christian folk wedding customs over the centuries of its influence on Slavic life, incorporated versions of this tradition into wedding liturgy, which is part of why it is documented with more clarity than many folk practices that existed only in oral tradition. The shoe, in other words, was not a quirky regional detail. It was a piece of legal technology, a physical object that made an abstract transfer of authority legible to everyone in the room, and cultures separated by thousands of miles independently arrived at the same metaphor. Caligula. The third emperor of Rome is remembered for a lot of things, and very few of them are flattering. Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, came to power in 37 AD to genuine public celebration, a welcome change after the paranoid final years of Tiberius. That goodwill evaporated fast. The historian Suetonius, writing roughly 80 years after his death, described an emperor who forced senators' wives and daughters into sexual service and then calmly reported the details back to their husbands at dinner the following evening, not out of carelessness, but deliberately, because watching powerful men sit in silence while he humiliated them was the point. He declared himself a living god, specifically Jupiter, and reportedly conducted divine marriages with statues of goddesses in the palace. According to Suetonius, he also carried on incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters, most intensely with Drusilla, who died in 38 AD and was subsequently deified, a grief that some historians read as genuine and others read as yet another performance of power. It's worth noting that Suetonius was a hostile source writing decades after the fact, and Roman political biography had a long tradition of blackening the reputations of dead emperors. But even accounting for exaggeration, the pattern that emerges is consistent: a man who treated absolute power as a license to make the humiliation of others into a daily ritual. He was assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard in 41 AD at the age of 28, having ruled for less than 4 years. The guards reportedly stabbed him 30 times. Nobody in the palace intervened. Empress Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian remains the only woman in Chinese history to assume the title of Empress Regnant, ruling in her own name from 690 to 705 AD, and the sheer improbability of that achievement meant her enemies worked overtime to destroy her reputation. She entered the Tang imperial court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong at the age of 14, which was not unusual for the era. What was unusual, deeply taboo under Confucian law, was that after Taizong's death, she became the consort of his son, Emperor Gaozong, a relationship that scandalized the court and gave her political opponents ammunition they would use for centuries. After consolidating power through decades of careful maneuvering, she reportedly maintained a rotating circle of young male favorites, whom hostile court officials dismissed as face powder officials, men who gained political access through personal proximity to the empress. Her two most prominent favorites were the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, young men she elevated to significant positions at court despite having no particular qualifications beyond being attractive and entertaining. Court officials openly mocked their influence, and the brothers were executed in 705 AD during the coup that forced Wu Zetian from power, the same year she died at approximately 80 years old. The critical context here is that nearly everything written about Wu Zetian's private conduct was authored by Confucian scholars who believed female rule was an unnatural catastrophe. For them, attributing sexual excess to her was a political act as much as a biographical one. Her actual documented legacy, administrative reform, expansion of the examination system, military campaigns, is the record of a highly capable ruler. The perversion narrative was, to a significant degree, the price of being a woman who refused to stay in her assigned place. King Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII is one of history's most recognizable monarchs, and the broad outline of his life, 6 wives, 2 executions, a church broken from Rome, is so well known it risks feeling mundane. It shouldn't. When Henry wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to pursue Anne Boleyn, he didn't simply divorce her. He dismantled the Catholic Church's authority in England, made himself supreme head of a new national church, and had anyone who publicly disagreed executed for treason. He broke a 1,000-year religious tradition for personal reasons and dressed it up as theology. Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536 on charges of adultery and incest that virtually all modern historians consider fabricated, manufactured to get rid of a wife who had failed to produce a male heir and had accumulated too many enemies. His 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was likely somewhere between 16 and 17 years old when she married Henry, who was 49, and by that point physically enormous. He had to be moved by mechanical hoists in his later years due to jousting injuries, obesity, and festering leg ulcers that reportedly made him smell appalling. Catherine's history before the marriage was already one of exploitation. As a girl in the household of her step-grandmother, she had been sexually abused by her music teacher Henry Manox, and then by a young man named Francis Dereham. Henry's court knew her background and married her to the king anyway. She was executed in 1542, probably still a teenager. What makes Henry's story particularly striking is that the mechanism of his desire, his need for a male heir, his impatience with any obstacle, his absolute refusal to be told no, reshaped the religious and political landscape of an entire nation. The Church of England exists, in part, because one man couldn't take rejection: Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV of Russia earned his epithet honestly, and his personal life was as chaotic as his reign. The Russian Orthodox Church canonically permitted 3 marriages. Ivan had approximately 7 or 8, depending on the source, with later marriages annulled under pressure or ended by the wife's suspicious death or forced removal to a convent. His 5th wife, Anna Vasilchikova, lasted months before being packed off to a monastery. His 6th, Vasilisa Melentieva, allegedly had her supposed lover executed in front of her before she followed the same path, though these later accounts come from Russian chronicles of debated reliability. Ivan's cruelties weren't confined to the marital. During the Oprichnina period between 1565 and 1572, he created a personal secret police force that terrorized the Russian nobility and committed mass atrocities across the country, using torture and sexual violence as instruments of political terror. His religiosity made none of this less extreme. He would pray intensely and then order executions, seemingly without contradiction. The moment that arguably defines his reign in human terms came in 1581, when in a rage over his daughter-in-law's allegedly immodest dress, he struck her so hard he may have caused a miscarriage. His son Ivan Ivanovich confronted him. Ivan killed his son with a staff blow to the head. He had just murdered his own heir and ended his dynasty's future in a single moment of violence. He died in 1584, reportedly while setting up a chessboard, leaving Russia to a reign of instability that historians would later call the Time of Troubles. Henry III of France. Henry III of France was one of the most mocked monarchs of the 16th century, and the people doing the mocking were extremely motivated. The Catholic League, his primary political enemies, produced some of the most vicious political pornography in European history. Pamphlets depicting the king in sexually explicit scenarios passed around Paris in the thousands. The central scandal was his mignons, a word meaning darlings or favorites, a group of elaborately dressed young men Henry showered with titles, gifts, and influence. The mignons were a genuine political problem. They held real access to the king. They were involved in violent duels that disrupted court life, and they were perceived as replacing legitimate, noble influence with personal favorites. Contemporary accounts also describe Henry cross-dressing at court balls, wearing elaborate feminine clothing and jewelry, whether this was fashionable performance, personal expression, or something else is genuinely debated by historians. His enemies attributed every possible vice to him, including an unhealthily close relationship with his mother, Catherine de' Medici, which was almost certainly political slander rather than fact. What's notable about Henry's case is how systematically his opponents used sexual scandal as a political weapon. The Catholic League needed to delegitimize a king they opposed on religious and dynastic grounds, and attacking his masculinity was the most effective tool available. Henry was assassinated in August 1589 by a Dominican friar, died without an heir, and ended the Valois line entirely. The pamphlets outlasted him by centuries. Peter the Great of Russia. Peter I transformed Russia into a European empire through sheer force of will, personal violence, and a level of institutional weirdness that remains difficult to fully convey. His most extraordinary personal creation was the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, a mock religious institution he established in the 1690s as a deliberate parody of the Orthodox Church, featuring blasphemous rituals, mass compulsory drunkenness, and degrading ceremonies staged purely for his amusement. Attendance was not optional. Courtiers who refused to participate in the humiliations faced real punishment. Peter forced nobles to drink until they collapsed, staged obscene parodies of church sacraments, and apparently found the spectacle of powerful men making fools of themselves endlessly entertaining. His first wife, Eudoxia, was removed to a convent so he could pursue his relationship with Martha Skavronskaya, a former servant of uncertain origin who eventually became Empress Catherine I. He maintained a Kunstkamera, a cabinet of curiosities founded in 1714 in St. Petersburg, stocked with preserved fetuses, anatomical specimens, and biological oddities he collected with genuine fascination. Accounts of his personal involvement in dissecting executed criminals exist in memoirs of the period, though their reliability varies. His treatment of his son Alexei was the darkest chapter. Accused of treason in 1718, Alexei died in custody following torture sessions that Peter was reportedly present for or involved in ordering. Peter had effectively tortured his own son to death. He died in 1725, having built St. Petersburg from a swamp and reshaped Russia into a continental power, the brutality and the achievement inseparable from each other. King Augustus the Strong. Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, cultivated a reputation for sexual conquest so enthusiastically that the number became the point. He claimed to have fathered over 300 illegitimate children, a figure historians now believe was grotesque exaggeration, with documented estimates closer to 8 to 10. Augustus promoted the legend himself because in 18th century court culture, an almost supernatural virility was a form of soft power, proof of a vitality that made you seem more than human. The reality behind the mythology was still striking. His most famous mistress, Countess Kosel, was granted quasi-royal status and given a signed promise of marriage. And when she fell out of favor and had the temerity to demand he honor it, she was imprisoned in Stolpen Castle, a stone fortress in Saxony, in 1716. She remained there for 49 years, until her death in 1765. His earlier mistress, Aurora von Königsmarck, was treated with considerably more dignity and later became famous as the mother of Maurice de Saxe, one of France's greatest military commanders. Augustus was also physically extraordinary in ways he weaponized socially. Strong enough to bend horseshoes and iron bars with his bare hands at court, a parlor trick he performed regularly as a demonstration of dominance. The fortune he spent on mistresses, palaces, and spectacle transformed Dresden into one of the most beautiful Baroque cities in Europe, earning it the nickname Florence on the Elbe. Power, appetite, and aesthetic ambition fused together into something that was either magnificent or monstrous, depending on whose perspective you occupied. Catherine the Great. Catherine II of Russia was German by birth, empress by coup, and by the end of her reign, one of the most powerful rulers in the world. She was also the subject of what may be history's most persistent and completely fabricated sexual myth, the horse story, which has no credible contemporary source, originated as political propaganda spread by her enemies, and has been thoroughly debunked by historians who've actually studied the period. What's interesting is that her documented behavior was already sufficiently scandalous by 18th century standards to fuel a lifetime of rumors without any invention required. Catherine maintained a formal series of official favorites over her 34-year reign, approximately 12 confirmed, including Grigory Orlov, who fathered one of her children, and Grigory Potemkin, with whom she maintained a relationship from around 1774 to 1791 that may have included a secret marriage. These weren't hidden affairs. The favorite system was quasi-institutionalized. Favorites received titles, vast estates, and millions of rubles. Potemkin was given effective governorship of an entire region of the empire. Memoirs from the period, including those of the diplomat Charles Joseph Deling, describe a selection process involving medical examination and a trial period, accounts that are colorful enough to take with some skepticism, but consistent across multiple independent sources. What made Catherine's situation genuinely unprecedented was the power dynamic in reverse. A reigning empress openly keeping young male favorites in a position of recognized official status flipped the traditional model entirely. Men had always done this. A woman doing it was a different kind of scandal, which is probably why her enemies felt they needed a horse to top it. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II became King of Bavaria at 19 years old in 1864 and spent most of his reign trying to escape the role entirely. He poured Bavaria's treasury into three fantasy palaces: Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, private obsessions he rarely allowed other people to enter, architectural dreams pulled from Wagnerian opera and medieval romance, and built in the Bavarian Alps with a thoroughness that bordered on madness. His relationship with Richard Wagner was the great passion of his life. He funded Wagner's work lavishly from the moment he came to power, wrote him letters of extraordinary intensity that exceeded anything a typical royal patron would produce, and was devastated when political pressure forced Wagner out of Munich in 1865. Ludwig's diaries, partially published, partially held in Bavarian state archives, suggest he was attracted to men and spent years in agonized conflict between his desires and his Catholic faith, recording prayers for forgiveness alongside descriptions of his feelings for male servants and military officers. In his later years, he became entirely nocturnal, held formal dinners for imaginary guests at tables set for people who were not there, and rode alone through the Alps at night in an elaborate sleigh. His ministers declared him mentally unfit for rule in June 1886, citing medical reports from a psychiatrist who had never examined him. 2 days later, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside that same psychiatrist. The official ruling was accidental drowning. Historians have never agreed on what actually happened, whether he was murdered, drowned during an escape attempt, or something else entirely. Neuschwanstein, the castle he built to disappear into, became the model for the Disney castle. Millions of tourists visit it every year. King Farouk of Egypt. Farouk I became King of Egypt in 1936 at the age of 16, and the trajectory of his reign describes a near-perfect arc from promising young monarch to cautionary symbol of royal decay. He began trim, charming, and genuinely popular. By the time he was deposed in the 1952 revolution, he weighed well over 300 pounds, had accumulated a palace full of documented pornography described by those who catalogued it as one of the largest private collections in the world, and was known across diplomatic circles for groping women at public functions with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been told no. His kleptomania was compulsive and apparently irresistible. He was widely reported to have pickpocketed Winston Churchill's watch during an official function, and to have stolen a ceremonial sword from the Shah of Iran, a story that appeared in multiple independent accounts and which says something remarkable about a man who could simply have asked for anything he wanted. He maintained a harem system while simultaneously conducting affairs that Egyptian officials and foreign diplomats documented in their correspondence with a mixture of outrage and weary resignation. After being forced from the throne, he went into exile in Monaco and then Rome, living in expensive hotels and continuing to eat and spend on an extraordinary scale. He died on March 18, 1965, at a restaurant table in Rome, reportedly mid-meal, having just finished ordering an enormous dinner. His reign is remembered in Egypt less as a personal story than as a systemic one, a monarchy so corroded by excess that when the army finally moved against him in 1952, almost nobody came to his defense. The last king of Egypt left on a yacht with 64 trunks of luggage and the clothes on his back. Caligula, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, started his reign in 37 AD as perhaps the most eagerly welcomed emperor Rome had ever seen. The people adored him. The Senate praised him. After the paranoid cruelty of Tiberius, here was a young man of 25 who seemed to represent everything Rome had hoped for. That goodwill lasted less than a year. Shortly after taking power, Caligula fell into a severe illness, and when he recovered, something had fundamentally changed. He declared himself a living god, a genuine reorganization of how he expected to be treated, demanding priests, temples, and offerings in his name. He reportedly held conversations with the moon goddess, wandering palace corridors at night to speak with her. He ordered his soldiers during a military campaign in northern Europe to collect seashells from the beach as spoils of war against Neptune, the sea god, an act so bizarre his generals complied in stunned silence. His most famous story, appointing his horse Incitatus as a consul, is disputed by some historians, who argue it was a calculated insult to the Senate rather than genuine delusion. What is not disputed is the financial catastrophe of his reign. He inherited a treasury surplus that his predecessor had accumulated over years, and emptied it completely within 12 months, through spectacles, feasts, and reckless construction. He executed people on whims, humiliated senators by forcing them to run alongside his chariot, and by his own family's account committed acts too disturbing for even his contemporaries to record neutrally. His Praetorian Guard assassinated him in January of 41 AD, after just under 4 years in power, stabbing him more than 30 times in a palace corridor. He was 28 years old. Nero. Nero came to power in 54 AD at just 16 years old, and spent the early part of his reign governed by his mother Agrippina and his tutor Seneca. Once he removed them from the picture, Agrippina by assassination, Seneca by forced retirement, what remained was a man of enormous insecurity and genuinely disturbing impulses, dressed in imperial purple. His mother's murder alone required 3 attempts, the first of which involved a specially constructed collapsible boat designed to sink with her aboard. She swam to shore. He eventually sent assassins to finish the job. His pregnant wife Poppaea reportedly died after he kicked her in the stomach, though some historians consider the account exaggerated. He performed publicly as a singer and actor, which in Roman society was considered deeply shameful for a man of any status, and he forced audiences to sit through his performances under threat of punishment. People reportedly faked their own deaths to be carried out of the theater. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which burned for 6 days and destroyed vast portions of the city, suspicion fell on Nero, with many believing the fire was deliberately set to clear land for his Domus Aurea, a golden palace complex so enormous it was said to cover up to 300 acres of prime Roman real estate. In his final years, paranoia consumed him entirely. He executed senators, generals, and former allies on the faintest suspicion of disloyalty. When a revolt finally succeeded in 68 AD, he fled Rome and, finding himself abandoned, reportedly wept that the world was losing such a great artist before helping drive a blade into his own throat. He was 30 years old. Justin II. Justin II became Byzantine emperor in 565 AD, and for the first years of his reign was considered a capable, if unremarkable, ruler. Then, around 574 AD, following a series of catastrophic military defeats, he suffered a complete and public mental collapse. According to the historian John of Ephesus, who witnessed events firsthand, Justin began biting his attendants. He made animal noises in court. He had to be wheeled through the palace on a specially constructed movable throne. During his worst episodes, he would attempt to eat the people around him. The court, unable to hide what was happening, introduced continuous live music throughout the imperial chambers, one of the earliest recorded uses of music as a psychiatric intervention, and reported that it had some calming effect. Modern historians have speculated that what Justin experienced may have been a severe stroke, extreme depression, or acute psychosis, and that the military disasters of his reign may have been the triggering event for an underlying vulnerability. Whether the cause was neurological or psychological, the practical consequence was the same. He ceded power to his general Tiberius as co-emperor in 574 AD, and never meaningfully governed again. He died in 578 AD, having spent his final years as an imperial figurehead, kept largely out of public sight. Charles VI of France. Charles VI inherited the French throne in 1380 and reigned for 42 years, though roughly half of that reign was conducted during periods of acute psychosis, so severe his courtiers weren't always sure which version of the king they were dealing with on any given morning. His first recorded episode came in 1392, during a military march, when a sudden loud noise caused him to draw his sword and attack his own knights, killing 4 of them before being physically restrained. The episodes that followed over the next 3 decades included one of history's most documented psychiatric phenomena, the glass delusion, in which Charles became convinced his body was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He refused physical contact entirely during these periods, reportedly having iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent accidental breakage, and froze in terror if anyone moved toward him too quickly. Between episodes he could be entirely lucid, governing normally, and behaving by all accounts like a functional king, which made his condition all the more destabilizing. No one at court ever quite knew what they would find. His instability was ruthlessly exploited by rival noble factions, with the Burgundians and Armagnacs essentially using his incapacity as a power vacuum to wage a proxy civil war, contributing to the conditions that allowed Henry V of England to claim the French throne. Joanna of Castile. Joanna of Castile became Queen of Castile in 1504, and, in a just world, would be remembered as one of the most powerful women in early modern European history. Instead, she is remembered as Joanna the Mad, a label applied by the two men who imprisoned her. The obsession with her husband Philip I was real and alarming by any contemporary account. She reportedly refused to allow women near him, flew into rages at the sight of attractive ladies-in-waiting, and followed his movements with an intensity that unnerved the entire court. When Philip died suddenly in 1506 at just 28 years old, Joanna's grief crossed into territory that contemporary observers found deeply disturbing. She refused to allow his coffin to be sealed or buried for months, traveling with it across the Spanish countryside, and, according to multiple accounts, opening it at intervals to kiss his face and hands. What happened after is where history gets complicated. Her father Ferdinand II had her declared incompetent and locked away at Tordesillas Castle in 1509. Her son Charles I, who would become Holy Roman Emperor, continued the imprisonment for the rest of her life. She remained technically queen for 50 years while never once being permitted to govern. Modern historians are genuinely divided on whether she was mentally ill or politically eliminated. The accounts of her madness come almost exclusively from the men who benefited from her removal. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV of Russia, the first man to hold the title of Tsar of all Russia, was not always terrible. His early reign showed genuine administrative talent. He reformed the legal code, expanded trade, and pushed back Russia's borders. The transformation accelerated in 1560 with the death of his first wife Anastasia, which Ivan became convinced was a poisoning orchestrated by the boyar nobility around him. Modern forensic analysis has lent this strange credibility, as high levels of mercury and arsenic were found in her remains. In 1565, he created the Oprichnina, a personal secret police force of several thousand men who dressed entirely in black, rode black horses, and carried dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles to symbolize that they would sniff out and sweep away treason. What they actually did was massacre entire towns on Ivan's orders. His psychological deterioration reached its most devastating moment in November 1581, when during an argument he struck his own son and heir, also named Ivan, with an iron-tipped staff, killing him. The famous painting by Ilya Repin depicting Ivan holding his dying son captures something contemporaries described accurately. Ivan never recovered from it psychologically, spending his remaining years swinging between violent rages and extreme religious guilt, alternating mass executions with days of fasting, weeping prayer, and self-flagellation. Rudolph II. Rudolph II became Holy Roman Emperor in 1576, and almost immediately began withdrawing from the actual business of ruling. He moved his court from Vienna to Prague, filling Prague Castle with alchemists, astrologers, painters, sculptors, clockmakers, and occult scholars. Rudolf suffered severe depressive episodes throughout his reign. Modern historians broadly agree this was likely what we would today call bipolar disorder, and during his lowest periods he could be unreachable for weeks, refusing audiences, ignoring correspondence, and leaving the empire to manage itself. His court became one of the most intellectually extraordinary in European history almost by accident. Tycho Brahe worked there, Johannes Kepler served as his court astronomer from 1601 onward, and the art he collected became foundational to several major European museums. Rudolf himself spent enormous resources on attempts to transmute base metals into gold. By the early 1600s, the Holy Roman Empire had drifted into near-total administrative paralysis, with religious conflicts escalating and territorial disputes going unresolved. His brother Matthias staged a formal coup against him in 1608, stripping him of authority over most of the Habsburg territories. Rudolf died in 1612, having accomplished very little politically, but having inadvertently made Prague one of the great centers of Renaissance thought. Christian VII of Denmark. Christian VII became King of Denmark and Norway in 1766, at the age of 17, and was, by nearly every contemporary account, already showing serious signs of mental illness before he ever sat on the throne. His symptoms included extreme mood swings, episodes of self-harm, dissociation from reality, and a compulsive need to slap visiting dignitaries. He would roll on the floor during state functions, wander palace corridors at night making strange noises, and during his lucid periods display a childlike passivity that made him easy to manipulate. The manipulation came swiftly and dramatically in the form of his personal physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, who rose from royal doctor to the most powerful man in Denmark in the space of 2 years, issuing over 1,000 royal decrees in Christian's name, and effectively running the country while the king nodded along. Struensee was arrested in 1772, tried for treason and adultery, and executed, his body publicly dismembered. Christian reigned as a nominal figurehead for another 36 years, kept presentable for official functions while real power passed between regents and council members. He died in 1808, having been king for over 40 years, without meaningfully governing for a single one of them. George III of Britain. George III ruled Britain for 60 years, oversaw the loss of the American colonies and the early years of the Napoleonic Wars, and is remembered by most of the world primarily for going mad. His episodes of acute mental illness, at least 4 major ones over the course of his reign, were characterized by incoherent rambling at unstoppable speed for hours, extreme physical agitation, and in the later episodes, full hallucinations. His urine turned a distinctive purple color during episodes, fueling the modern theory that he suffered from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that causes severe neurological and psychiatric symptoms. The porphyria theory was proposed in 1969 and has been both widely accepted and substantially challenged since. Some historians argue the evidence better fits bipolar disorder or another psychiatric condition. What is not disputed is how he was treated. Doctors of the era responded to his episodes with straitjackets, restraint chairs, cold baths, and a treatment philosophy that amounted to yelling authority at the king until he calmed down. His final episode began in 1810 and never lifted. The Regency Act of 1811 handed power to his son, the future George IV, while George III spent his last decade at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, bearded, and entirely lost to reality, dying in 1820 at the age of 81. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II became King of Bavaria in 1864, at 18 years old, and for a brief period engaged with politics well enough that no one anticipated what was coming. What was coming was Neuschwanstein. Beginning in 1869, Ludwig began pouring the Bavarian royal treasury into a series of fantasy castles built in the Alpine wilderness, each one more elaborate than the last. He dined alone at a table set for imaginary guests, held conversations with historical figures he believed to be present in the room, and in his later years stopped attending government functions entirely, communicating with ministers only through written notes passed through intermediaries. He rode through mountain snowfields at midnight in a gilded sleigh lit by torchlight, slept through the day, and conducted what remained of his royal business in the small hours of the morning. In June 1886, a panel of psychiatrists declared him insane without ever conducting a personal examination. He was deposed and taken to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg. The following evening, June the 13th of 1886, he went for a walk with his psychiatrist along the lake shore, and both men were found dead in the water hours later. The lake was waist deep. The official cause of death was drowning, but whether it was suicide, murder, or accident has never been conclusively established. Otto of Bavaria. Otto of Bavaria was Ludwig II's younger brother and became King of Bavaria in 1886, without anyone seriously pretending he would ever actually rule. Otto had been showing severe symptoms of mental illness since his mid-20s, long before he became king, with accounts describing him crawling on all fours, screaming uncontrollably during church services, and behaving in ways that made it impossible to present him in any public capacity. He had been confined at Fürstenried Palace since 1883. When Ludwig II died, under those murky circumstances in June 1886, the succession passed to Otto purely as a dynastic technicality. His uncle Luitpold was immediately appointed Prince Regent, and governed Bavaria for the entirety of what was nominally Otto's reign. Otto never sat on the throne, never signed a document, never made a single royal decision, and was never seen in public during his 27 years as king. The throne was simply occupied by his name, while someone else ran the country. He was eventually formally deposed in 1913, because the legal fiction of his kingship had become administratively inconvenient. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg. Maria Eleonora married Gustav II Adolf of Sweden in 1620 and immediately made her obsessive devotion to him the defining and increasingly alarming feature of her queenship. She resented the birth of their daughter Christina in 1626, with a ferocity that shocked the Swedish court. She had wanted a son, and she made no effort to conceal her disappointment or her hostility toward the child. When Gustav II Adolf was killed at the Battle of Lutzen on November 6 of 1632, Maria Eleonora's grief became something else entirely. She refused to allow his body to be buried for over a year, keeping his heart in a golden casket that she placed beside her bed and slept near each night, and reportedly insisting that his coffin remain in her chambers as a constant presence. The Swedish Regency Council, which now had to govern in the name of 6-year-old Queen Christina, became increasingly alarmed at Maria Eleonora's behavior around the child. Accounts describe a mother who alternated between suffocating possessiveness and open hostility. The council eventually removed Christina from her mother's custody entirely. Maria Eleonora fled Sweden for Denmark in 1640, living in self-imposed exile for years before being permitted to return, spending the remainder of her life politically isolated. White lead face paint. Ceruse, also called Venetian ceruse, was the defining cosmetic of European royal courts from roughly the 1500s through the 1700s, and it was made almost entirely of lead acetate. The logic behind it was simple and brutal. Pale skin meant you never worked outdoors. And in a world where your complexion announced your social rank before you opened your mouth, aristocratic women, and many men, applied this thick white paste to their faces, necks, and chests every single day. Queen Elizabeth I is the most famous documented user. Her portraits showing that iconic chalk-white face with the high forehead and ghostly throat, and she wore it for approximately 30 years until her death in 1603. What those portraits don't show is what the ceruse was doing underneath. Lead absorbs directly through skin with prolonged contact, accumulating in soft tissue and bone over years, and the symptoms of chronic lead poisoning read like a slow-motion catastrophe. Hair loss, blackening and pitting of the skin, abdominal cramps, cognitive decline, seizures, and eventual organ failure. The cruelest part of the ceruse cycle was its self-reinforcing logic. The lead damaged and discolored the skin it touched, so wearers applied more ceruse to cover the damage, which caused more damage, which required more ceruse. Women who wore it daily also inadvertently ingested it by licking or biting their lips, adding internal exposure to the external. The direct causal link between Elizabeth I's ceruse use and her death is debated by historians, but the chemistry is not debatable at all. 30 years of daily lead application to the face is not something a human body survives without serious consequences. Arsenic green dye. When Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele invented his brilliant emerald green pigment in 1775, he created what would become the most fashionable and most quietly lethal color in European history. Scheele's green, and its successor Paris green, formulated in 1814, achieved their vivid color through copper arsenite, a compound that released arsenic dust continuously, especially when the fabric was warmed by body heat or moistened by sweat. This was not an abstract danger. Aristocratic women wore ball gowns, gloves, headdresses, and decorative flowers made with this dye, spending entire evenings dancing in heated rooms while arsenic particles drifted off every fold of their skirts and settled on their skin and into their lungs. The color was so desirable at court, so strongly associated with wealth and fashion, that warnings published in The Lancet in the 1850s and 1860s were largely ignored by the same women who could afford to read them. Factory workers producing the fabric died in documented numbers, their cases creating the first public evidence that the green was lethal. Queen Victoria's court was reportedly saturated with the color before its dangers became impossible to deny. Napoleon Bonaparte adds another layer to this story. The green painted wallpaper at his residence on St. Helena is suspected by some researchers to have released arsenic vapor into his living quarters, a hypothesis supported by analysis of hair samples taken after his death, though not universally accepted by historians. The green that glittered under candlelight in every fashionable ballroom in Europe was, at the molecular level, shedding poison with every movement. Heavily boned corsets. The boned corset is probably the most famous dangerous fashion item in history, but the reality was considerably more systematic and more damaging than its reputation suggests. Whalebone and later steel-boned corsets compressed the torso to achieve the fashionable silhouette, and at the extreme end of tight lacing, Adult women reduced their waists to 16 or 18 inches, measurements that required the internal organs to physically move to accommodate them. The liver, stomach, and intestines were pushed downward and sideways. The lower ribs were deformed inward. The lungs, unable to fully expand against the rigid boning, could not take a complete breath, which is why fainting was so normalized in aristocratic women of this era that dedicated fainting couches and fainting rooms were standard features of grand houses, treated as practical furniture rather than medical emergencies. Court presentation in some royal families required corsets from girlhood, meaning the skeletal deformation began before bones had finished developing, permanently reshaping the skeleton around the fashion rather than the other way around. Catherine de' Medici reportedly mandated a 13-inch waist at the French court, though historians debate whether this figure is accurate or has been exaggerated over centuries of retelling. What is well attested is that 19th-century medical journals published explicit articles attributing internal injuries, displacement of organs, and respiratory illness to corseting, and that the doctors writing those articles were largely ignored by the aristocratic patients they were treating. Breathing was not just uncomfortable in a tightly laced corset, it was mechanically restricted, and women who were simultaneously wearing heavy skirts weighing upward of 14 pounds were operating their bodies under conditions that would be considered dangerous in any modern context. Powdered wigs. The powdered wig became mandatory at European courts after Louis XIV adopted one to disguise his premature baldness sometime around 1655. And for the next century, it was one of the most reliable markers of aristocratic status on the continent. The powder used to whiten them, a mixture of starch, chalk, and sometimes flour, was applied in dedicated powdering rooms where it was blown onto the wig in clouds, inevitably coating the scalp, face, and lungs of everyone present. Some suppliers added lead or arsenic compounds to their powder formulations depending on the era and region, meaning the inhalation risk went beyond simple starch. Servants who powdered wigs daily suffered the highest exposure, but aristocrats who spent their mornings in powdering rooms were breathing this mixture consistently for years. The lice and flea infestations that thrived in warm, complex wig structures created a parallel danger. Louse-borne typhus killed more people in this era than many battlefield engagements, and the aristocratic habit of wearing elaborate hairpieces over their own hair created ideal conditions for infestation. Women's wigs grew to documented extremes, with some court examples exceeding 3 feet in height, requiring their wearers to kneel inside carriages or ride with their heads out of windows to avoid crushing the structure. The fashion also created a documented strain on grain supplies, with enormous quantities of flour consumed by aristocratic hairstyles during periods of scarcity, a social tension that fed directly into the revolutionary sentiment building in France and Britain. The British powder tax of 1795 effectively ended the fashion by making it expensive, which means the thing that finally killed the powdered wig was economics, rather than any recognition of the health toll it had been taking for generations. Hoop skirts and crinolines. The steel cage crinoline, patented in 1856, democratized a fashion that had previously required layers of heavy petticoats and made it available to almost any woman who could afford fabric. But in doing so, it also distributed one of the most consistently lethal garments in fashion history across an enormous population. The skirts produced by cage crinolines could measure up to 18 feet in circumference, and the steel framework that held them out also held them away from the body and allowed air to circulate freely beneath the fabric. In an era of open fireplaces and candles, this was catastrophically dangerous. The combination of large surface area, freely circulating air, and proximity to open flame meant that crinoline fires spread faster than the wearer could react, and contemporary newspapers reported them with the resigned frequency of a recurring seasonal hazard. An estimated 3,000 women died from crinoline fires in England between 1850 and 1860, though historians note that the precision of this figure is uncertain and some dispute its accuracy, even while acknowledging that crinoline fire deaths were genuinely numerous and well documented. Empress Eugenie of France, one of the most prominent crinoline wearers of the era and a major trendsetter across European courts, helped cement the fashion at the highest social levels precisely when its dangers were becoming undeniable. Beyond fire, the sheer mechanical reality of wearing an 18-foot bell of fabric caused carriage accidents, staircase falls, entanglement in machinery, and the inability to pass safely through standard doorways. The previous generation of petticoat-only skirts, before the cage crinoline reduced the weight, had caused documented spinal problems simply through the sustained load of carrying up to 14 pounds of fabric attached to the waist. High platform shoes. Venetian chopines represent one of the most literal translations of status into physical danger in fashion history. These platform shoes, worn by aristocratic women in Venice and Spain from roughly the 1400s through the 1650s, grew in height as they grew in social significance until the tallest surviving examples in the Museo Correr in Venice stand between 47 and 54 centimeters, nearly 20 inches, off the ground. The original purpose was practical, lifting the wearer above the muddy, waste-covered streets of Venice. But status competition transformed them into something that made independent walking essentially impossible. At extreme heights, wearing chopines required two servants walking alongside to physically support the wearer upright, and the fashion effectively converted aristocratic women into objects to be transported rather than people who moved under their own power. Falls from chopines cause broken bones and in pregnant wearers miscarriages, and at least one death from a fall is cited in historical sources. Though specific documentation is difficult to confirm, the shoes were typically constructed from wood or cork and covered in velvet, silk, or leather, sometimes decorated with gold and jewels, and worn with elaborate gowns that added considerable additional weight to an already unstable structure. The Venetian government periodically attempted to regulate chopine heights, apparently recognizing that the fashion had reached a point of genuine public safety concern, though enforcement seems to have been inconsistent. Shakespeare references them casually in Hamlet. "Your ladyship is nearer to heaven than when I saw you last, by the altitude of a chopine," suggesting that by the Elizabethan era, the absurdity and the danger of the style were both common enough knowledge to work as a throwaway joke. Radium jewelry and cosmetics. When Marie Curie discovered radium in 1898, she inadvertently handed the luxury goods industry one of the most dangerous marketing opportunities in history. Radium glowed softly in the dark with a blue-green light. It was extraordinarily rare, and in the years before its effects were understood, it was marketed as a health-giving, vitalizing substance that could rejuvenate the body and clarify the skin. Aristocratic and wealthy women wore radium-infused jewelry against their skin, kept radium face creams on their dressing tables, and traveled to radium spa treatments, all while receiving continuous ionizing radiation that was quietly damaging their DNA and dramatically elevating their cancer risk. The French cosmetic brand Thoradia was active in the 1930s, openly incorporating radium and thorium into its product line and marketing them as scientifically advanced beauty treatments. Eben Byers, a prominent American socialite and golf champion, drank a radium-laced health tonic called Radithor until his bones began to disintegrate. His death in 1932 and the Wall Street Journal's headline, "The Radium Water Worked Fine Until His Jaw Fell Off," effectively marked the end of radium's fashionable period, though some products persisted beyond it. The most chilling legacy of radium cosmetics is material. Vintage containers from this era, occasionally surfacing in antique collections, have been found to be measurably radioactive and are now handled as hazardous materials. The half-life of radium-226 is approximately 1,600 years, which means those elegant glass bottles on those dressing tables are still radiating today, and will be for a very long time after everyone who once wore them has been forgotten. Antimony-based rouge and kohl. Long before European courts discovered the cosmetic possibilities of lead and arsenic, ancient Egyptian royalty were applying heavy eye cosmetics containing lead sulfide and antimony sulfide to their faces as part of daily court ritual. Archaeological analysis of cosmetic pots from royal Egyptian contexts has confirmed the presence of both galena and stibnite, the mineral forms of these compounds, applied thickly around the eyes where the mucous membranes offer direct absorption into the bloodstream. Antimony causes nausea, vomiting, heart arrhythmia, and liver damage with sustained exposure, and applying it to the eyes daily from childhood, as royal Egyptian court protocol required, constituted a form of chronic low-level poisoning that accumulated over a lifetime. Medieval and Renaissance European courts later adopted antimony-based rouge and lip color, compounding the danger by adding topical exposure to a substance that was simultaneously being prescribed internally as a purging medicine by royal physicians, meaning some aristocratic patients were receiving antimony from their cosmetics and their doctors at the same time. The etymology of the word antimony is genuinely disputed. One popular account traces it to the Latin antimoine, meaning against monks, stemming from a story about monks who died after being given the compound as a fattening supplement, though linguists note this origin is not definitively established. Some historians have suggested speculatively that the cumulative heavy metal exposure in royal courts, from cosmetics, medicines, and leaded tableware simultaneously, may have contributed to the erratic behavior and declining health documented in various monarchs, though establishing direct causation across centuries is inherently difficult. Mercuric chloride skin lighteners. Mercury-based skin lighteners circulated through European and East Asian aristocratic beauty culture from roughly the 16th through the 19th centuries under names like Bloom of Youth and various other elegantly marketed titles that gave no indication of what they actually contained. Mercuric chloride, corrosive sublimate, worked by destroying melanin-producing cells in the skin, producing the pale, even complexion associated with nobility and indoor leisure. It worked visibly, at least temporarily, which made it genuinely convincing as a product before the cumulative effects became impossible to ignore. Long-term mercury exposure causes peripheral neuropathy, tooth loss, tremors, severe personality changes, memory deterioration, and kidney failure. The phrase "mad as a hatter" derives from hat makers who used mercury nitrate to process felt and suffered well-documented neurological damage. Same family of compounds was being applied to aristocratic faces as a beauty product during the same historical period, sometimes by the same chemical suppliers. In East Asian royal contexts, particularly within the Japanese imperial court, heavy white cosmetic appearances were required by court protocol, and mercury-based whiteners were documented components of the preparations used to achieve them. The Minamata disease outbreak in 1950s Japan, caused by industrial mercury contamination, provided modern medicine with a detailed clinical picture of what mercury does to the human nervous system at scale. And that picture maps almost exactly onto the symptoms described in historical accounts of prolonged cosmetic mercury use in aristocratic women centuries earlier. Tight neck stocks and collars. The military neck stock, a stiff leather or heavily starched cloth band buckled tightly around the throat, was mandatory in Prussian, French, and British military court dress from roughly the 1680s onward, and its stated purpose was to enforce the upright, rigid posture considered to convey martial bearing and aristocratic discipline. What it also did was create a documented choking hazard for any soldier who lost consciousness. Officers who fell in battle or collapsed from heat exhaustion could and did suffocate on their own stocks when no one was present to unbuckle them, and some accounts of the Battle of Waterloo reference soldiers found dead from causes that included constriction rather than wounds alone, though specific documentation for this is difficult to verify with precision. In civilian aristocratic men's fashion, the Regency-era obsession with high cravats and extreme collar points produced garments that physically restricted neck rotation to the point where some prominent dandies could not turn their heads independently and had to rotate their entire torsos to look sideways. Beau Brummel, the defining arbiter of Regency fashion, who was at the height of his influence between roughly 1800 and 1816, reportedly devoted hours to achieving the perfect cravat knot, and the heavily starched results pressed rigid fabric against the throat and jaw for entire days at court. High collar points constructed from stiffened card or bone lacerated the chin and jaw during movement, creating small chronic wounds that could become infected in an era before antibiotics, meaning the fashion that was meant to signal civilized refinement was also, at the edges, quietly cutting the people wearing it. Arsenic complexion wafers. Arsenic complexion pills and wafers were sold openly throughout the 19th century and consumed by aristocratic and upper-class women as a daily beauty regimen, not applied externally but swallowed, on the theory that internal arsenic would purify the blood and produce the clear pale skin that court appearance demanded. The chemistry, perversely, worked in the short term. Low doses of arsenic forced the body to produce new skin tissue while damaging capillaries near the surface, temporarily reducing redness and producing a pale, fine-textured appearance that made the product genuinely convincing. The fashion was partly inspired by reports of peasants in the Styrian region of Austria who allegedly consumed arsenic habitually and appeared robustly healthy, an observation documented in 19th-century sources but contested by modern historians who note that the health of those Styrian communities was probably being assessed by observers who had little basis for comparison. Long-term arsenic ingestion causes peripheral neuropathy, skin cancers, liver damage, and cardiovascular disease, and women who took complexion wafers daily were accumulating arsenic in their systems with no mechanism for eliminating it. The macabre overlap that gives this particular trend its sharpest edge is that arsenic was simultaneously the era's most notorious murder poison, called inheritance powder for its frequent use in poisoning wealthy relatives, and a product sold openly in elegant packaging on the same dressing tables where those wealthy relatives kept their other cosmetics. Fowler's solution, a medicinal arsenic preparation prescribed by doctors throughout the 19th century for conditions ranging from skin disorders to malaria, meant that some aristocratic women were receiving arsenic from their beauticians, their apothecaries, and their physicians simultaneously, with no one coordinating the total dose. Ptolemaic royal marriages. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for roughly 300 years, from 305 BC until 30 BC. And for most of that time, they did something that would strike most people today as immediately, viscerally wrong. They married each other. Not cousins, not distant relatives, but brothers and sisters, full siblings, by deliberate theological design. The reasoning was religious rather than merely political. The Ptolemies had adopted the Egyptian tradition of divine kingship, casting themselves as living embodiments of Osiris and Isis, the brother and sister gods whose union sustained the cosmos. To marry outside the family was to break the divine symmetry the whole system depended on. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe II around 270 BC, and the dynasty repeated this pattern across generations, with the kind of institutional momentum that made each individual marriage feel inevitable rather than chosen. What this meant in practice, on actual wedding nights, was a young woman being brought to the bed of a man who was also her brother, inside a palace where everyone from the priests to the court officials had not only sanctioned this arrangement, but actively celebrated it. The brides were frequently teenagers. The grooms were sometimes significantly older, sometimes already married to other women, sometimes both. The wedding ceremonies themselves were lavish, multi-day affairs with religious ritual layered over political theater. But the intimacy waiting at the end of them was governed entirely by the husband's power, and that husband happened to be the same person who had grown up in the same household. The generational consequences were eventually visible in the dynasty's later rulers, several of whom showed signs that historians and medical researchers have attributed to the compounding effects of inbreeding across many successive generations. Later Ptolemaic kings were described by contemporary sources as unstable, physically unwell, and prone to spectacular cruelty. And at least some of that cruelty was directed at the same women they had married. Several Ptolemaic queens were exiled or murdered by the husband-brother they had wed in a ceremony, explicitly designed to mirror divine love. Cleopatra III was married to her own son, Ptolemy IX, in an arrangement that collapsed into mutual attempts at assassination. The dynasty's marriage structure guaranteed proximity and denied escape. There was no private life separate from the political one, no bedroom that was not also a throne room in miniature. The wedding night, for a Ptolemaic princess, was not a beginning so much as a formal acknowledgement of a cage she had been born into. Mary Queen of Scots and Francis II of France. On the 24th of April, 1558, a 15-year-old Scottish girl, in a white dress, walked into Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and married the 14-year-old heir to the French throne. The white dress was considered scandalous by some members of the French court, because white was traditionally the French color of mourning. But Mary Stuart wore it anyway, and the crowd that had gathered in the streets of Paris reportedly cheered for her beauty and wept at the spectacle. The ceremony was one of the most magnificent dynastic events of the 16th century. The wedding night that followed it was almost certainly nothing at all. Francis, the Dauphin of France, was by all contemporary accounts a deeply unwell young man. He was small for his age, physically underdeveloped, chronically ill with respiratory problems that had plagued him since childhood, and widely understood by the court physicians attending him to be unlikely to live a long life. Historians have debated for centuries whether the marriage was ever consummated, and the current consensus leans toward almost certainly not that night, and possibly not ever during the 2 years the marriage lasted. What is certain is that Mary was a teenager transplanted into a foreign court, married to a boy who could barely breathe without difficulty, surrounded by French courtiers who viewed her primarily as a diplomatic instrument, and presided over by a formidable mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, who had spent decades navigating exactly the kind of court politics that Mary was entirely unprepared for. The gap between the spectacle of the wedding and the reality of the bedchamber was absolute. The candles, the crowds, the gowns, the pageantry of 2 crowns joined, and then a sick boy and a bewildered girl in a room together, with nothing happening and neither of them having the language to explain why. Francis died on the 5th of December, 1560, aged 16, leaving Mary a teenage widow in a country where she held no real power and no real future. She returned to Scotland in 1561 to rule a kingdom she barely knew, haunted by a marriage that had produced nothing except the memory of what a wedding was supposed to look like. Isabella of Valois and Richard II of England. When Richard II of England married Isabella of Valois in October of 1396, she was 6 years old. Some sources give her age as 7, and the exact date of her birth is uncertain enough that historians hedge, but every version of the account agrees that she was a small child, not a young woman, not even an adolescent, but a little girl in ceremonial robes being transported from France to England to be installed as queen of a foreign country. Richard was 29. The marriage was a peace treaty dressed in human form, a diplomatic settlement between England and France that required a royal seal, and Isabella was the seal. Richard himself stipulated, and this was considered honorable by the standards of the time, that she would not be treated as a wife in any physical sense until she came of age. That stipulation is its own kind of horror, not because of what it prevented, but because of what it reveals about the baseline from which it was considered an act of decency. The court apparently required explicit instruction not to treat a 6-year-old as a sexual partner. The instruction was given, the instruction was followed, and then Isabella was separated from her family, her language, her entire world, and installed in English palaces where she was dressed as a queen and treated as a political object, because that is precisely what she was. Richard's later behavior, his increasing erraticism, his paranoia, his political self-destruction that led to his deposition by Henry IV in 1399 and his murder in 1400, has been interpreted by some historians as the unraveling of a man who had genuinely grown attached to a child he was not allowed to touch, which is its own disturbing dimension. After Richard's death, Isabella was returned to France. She married again, a second arranged marriage to a French duke, and she died in childbirth in 1409, somewhere between 19 and 20 years old. She had been a queen of England, a widow, and a dead mother before she reached 21, and it had all begun with a ceremony at Calais when she was too young to understand what was happening to her. Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur. The wedding night of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur, which took place in November of 1501, is probably the most consequential single night in the history of the English Reformation, and nobody in the room knew it. Arthur was 15, and had been described by contemporaries as pale, thin, and showing signs of the illness that would kill him within 5 months, most likely sweating sickness or early tuberculosis, though the exact cause of his death has never been definitively established. Catherine was 16, a Spanish princess who had traveled to England to fulfill a betrothal arranged when both children were toddlers. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral in London was a national celebration. What followed it was a ceremonial bedding ritual in which attendants, courtiers, and witnesses formally escorted the couple to their chamber, drew the curtains, and left them together, the privacy of the moment being entirely performative given the number of people who had just participated in staging it. The following morning, Arthur reportedly made a remark to his attendants that has been recorded, in various forms, as a boast about having been in Spain the previous night. A crude contemporary expression indicating consummation. Catherine denied, for the rest of her life, that anything had happened. She maintained her virginity at the time of her marriage to Henry VIII in 1509, with a consistency and force that never wavered, not during 8 years of marriage to Henry, not during the years of the annulment proceedings that stretched from 1527 to 1533, not under any pressure the English court or the papacy could bring to bear on her. The entire question of what happened in that bedchamber on a single night in 1501 became the hinge on which the English Reformation turned. Henry's case for annulment rested on Leviticus and the claim that his marriage to his brother's widow was invalid in the eyes of God. If the first marriage had not been consummated, there was no widow in any meaningful sense, and the argument collapsed. Arthur's reported comment survives only in testimony given during the annulment proceedings decades later, by witnesses recalling what a dying teenager had said to them one morning, which is exactly the kind of evidence that historians treat with great caution. Catherine's consistent denial survives in her own words, under conditions of extreme political and personal pressure, which is a different kind of evidence entirely. Whatever the truth of it, 5 months after the wedding Arthur was dead, and a night that 2 teenagers had lived through in a curtained room became one of the most argued-over events in English legal and religious history. Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII. Henry VIII agreed to marry Anne of Cleves in 1539, based primarily on a portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger, which depicted her as attractive, serene, and appropriately regal. When Henry rode to Rochester in January of 1540 to surprise her, he was so appalled by what he found that he reportedly tried to leave without identifying himself, and later described the encounter to Thomas Cromwell with the kind of blunt contempt that no diplomatic language could soften. The marriage proceeded anyway because the political alliance with the Protestant German states it represented was too valuable to abandon, and on the 6th of January 1540, Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves at the Palace of Greenwich in a ceremony conducted in a freezing English January. That night, nothing happened. Not a little. Nothing at all. Henry was impotent with her, and he was not shy about explaining why to his physicians in terms that have survived in the historical record. He described her body in clinical, contemptuous detail, her breasts, her belly, what he alleged were physical signs that she was not a virgin, a claim with no basis in any evidence, and which says considerably more about Henry's psychology in the moment than it does about Anne's history. His physician's account of these conversations is one of the more remarkable documents of the Tudor period, a king explaining, at length and with apparent bewilderment, why he had been unable to perform on his wedding night. Anne's ladies-in-waiting reported that she had no idea what had gone wrong or why the marriage wasn't working, and that she required what amounted to a basic education about what a consummated marriage was supposed to involve, which suggests that she too had arrived at her wedding night with very little preparation. The marriage lasted 6 months. Henry had it annulled on the 9th of July 1540. Anne, demonstrating a political intelligence that none of Henry's other wives quite matched in this particular regard, agreed immediately, accepted a generous financial settlement, several properties, and the title of the king's sister, and proceeded to outlive Henry and all 5 of his other wives. She died on the 16th of July 1557, at peace, financially comfortable and free. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match, was executed in the same year the marriage was annulled, partly as a consequence of having gotten it so badly wrong. Anne of Cleves is often described as the lucky one among Henry's wives, and in many respects she was, but her wedding night remains one of the most humiliating documented encounters in the history of royal marriage. A night whose failure echoed outward and destroyed careers, ended a man's life, and left a woman who had done nothing wrong standing in a palace wondering what had just happened. Mary I of England and Philip II of Spain. When Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain at Winchester Cathedral on the 25th of July 1554, she was 37 years old, and he was 27. Mary had waited her entire life for this. She had been declared illegitimate as a child, isolated from her mother, stripped of her title, and subjected to decades of political humiliation. She had finally fought her way onto the English throne in 1553, and now she had the marriage that was supposed to secure everything: a Catholic husband, a Catholic succession, a reversal of everything her father and brother had done to England's faith. Philip had a different view of the situation. His letters to his confidants, written before and during the marriage, described the match in the language of cold diplomatic obligation. He found her physically unappealing. He found England cold and unfamiliar. He understood the marriage as a political necessity and approached it accordingly. Contemporary accounts describe the wedding night as perfunctory, the word itself carrying more weight the longer you sit with it. A man fulfilling a duty. A woman believing herself finally arrived at the life she deserved. Those two experiences happening in the same room, in the same bed, with an absolute gulf between them. Mary became convinced she was pregnant almost immediately. The court prepared. The physicians confirmed. The nursery was made ready. The due date came and passed and nothing happened. And then more time passed and nothing happened. And eventually it became undeniable that there was no child. Mary experienced what historians now describe as a phantom pregnancy, a condition in which psychological and emotional desperation produced every physical symptom of pregnancy without any actual fetus. Some accounts suggest she may have experienced a second phantom pregnancy as well. Philip left England in August of 1555, roughly a year after the wedding, returned briefly in 1557, and then was gone. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558, believing she had failed at the one thing she had survived everything else to accomplish. She had burned nearly 300 Protestant martyrs in the name of a Catholic restoration that died with her, Her husband had barely been able to endure living in the same country. It had all been set in motion by a wedding night in Winchester that was, from the moment it began, two people experiencing entirely different events: Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. On the 16th of May, 1770, a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess named Marie Antoinette married a 15-year-old French prince named Louis Auguste at the Palace of Versailles, and that night, surrounded by the most opulent court in Europe, he went to sleep. Not metaphorically. He wrote in his diary, which has survived, a single word for the date of his wedding night: rien, meaning nothing. Louis XVI did not consummate the marriage that night. He did not consummate it the following night, or the following month, or the following year. The marriage remained unconsummated for 7 years, and during those 7 years it became, by slow and excruciating degrees, a matter of international political crisis. Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, wrote her letters that have been preserved and published, and reading them is an extraordinary experience. A woman of immense political power writing to her teenage daughter in a foreign court, asking, with increasing urgency, for updates on the state of the marriage bed, because the entire diplomatic purpose of the match depended on an heir, and the heir required something that was not happening. Marie Antoinette's responses describe her situation with a mixture of bafflement, embarrassment, and the particular loneliness of a person who cannot explain a problem they do not fully understand. The exact reason for Louis' inability or unwillingness has been debated ever since. The most commonly cited explanation is a physical condition called phimosis, which would have made consummation painful enough to deter a young man who was already shy, private, and deeply uncomfortable with the public performance of his personal life. Some historians believe minor surgery or simply a decision to try more seriously resolved the issue around 1777, and Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother on the same day, with barely contained joy. Their first child was born on the 19th of December, 1778, 8 years after their wedding. The 7 unconsummated years, however, had done their work. The court gossips had filled the silence with rumors. Pamphlets had circulated through Paris suggesting explanations for the failure that ranged from the plausible to the vicious. And many of those pamphlets attacked Marie Antoinette's character rather than Louis's physiology, because that was the direction the culture's contempt naturally flowed. The rumors about her fidelity, her sexuality, and her morality that those years of gossip generated followed her for the rest of her life, and contributed to the dehumanization that made her execution on the 16th of October, 1793, possible. The whole catastrophe had a beginning point, and that beginning point was a wedding night at Versailles when a 15-year-old boy went to sleep. Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon Bonaparte divorced Josephine in 1809 because she had not given him an heir, and within months he had arranged a marriage to Marie-Louise, an 18-year-old Austrian archduchess, the daughter of the emperor he had repeatedly defeated in war. Marie-Louise had been raised in a court where Napoleon Bonaparte was, quite literally, used as a figure to frighten children into obedience. The propaganda directed at Austrian aristocrats and their families during the years of French-Austrian conflict had depicted Napoleon as a monster in the most vivid possible terms. Physically grotesque, morally savage, the enemy of civilization. When she was informed she was to marry him, she reportedly wept and told her ladies she would rather die. Then she met him at Compiègne, a few days before the official ceremonies were scheduled to take place. Apparently, the meeting went better than she expected. Napoleon, who was 40 years old to her 18, was by all accounts at his most charming and attentive, and Marie-Louise's subsequent letters to her father describe a cautious, surprised reassessment of the man she had been told to fear. What happened next reflects everything about Napoleon's character in the most concentrated possible form. The civil marriage ceremony took place on the 11th of March, 1810. The religious ceremony was not scheduled until the 2nd of April. Napoleon did not wait. He consummated the marriage the night of the civil ceremony, 3 weeks before the religious rites that were supposed to sanctify it, apparently on the grounds that he had waited long enough and the civil ceremony was sufficient. His confidants recorded his reported comments about the experience with the cheerful crudeness characteristic of his private correspondence. Marie-Louise's own letters from the period are more careful. She describes finding him less frightening than expected, and finding the situation less terrible than she had anticipated, which are the words of a young woman choosing her phrases very deliberately. She was 18 years old, in a foreign country, in bed with a man 40 years old who happened to control most of Europe, and the entire purpose of her presence there was reproductive. She fulfilled that purpose. Napoleon II was born on the 20th of March, 1811. Napoleon was exiled in 1814, and Marie-Louise did not follow him. She returned to Austria, entered a relationship with an Austrian general, and lived until 1847, long outlasting the empire that had consumed her youth. Princess Alexandra of Denmark and King Edward VII. Alexandra of Denmark married the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 10th of March, 1863. She was 18, he was 21. The wedding was one of the great public spectacles of the Victorian era, watched by an enormous crowd and celebrated throughout Britain as the union of a beautiful Danish princess and the heir to the greatest empire in the world. What Alexandra either knew or was about to discover was that her husband had, in the months before their wedding, been involved with an actress named Nellie Clifton, that the affair had become known to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and that Prince Albert's profound distress at the revelation had contributed to the deterioration of his health in his final weeks. Albert died in December of 1861, and Victoria, in her grief, directed a portion of blame at her son for the rest of her life. Alexandra arrived into a family already fractured by her future husband's behavior, and that behavior did not change after the wedding. Edward VII spent the decades of their marriage conducting affairs with a series of women, some of them conducted with a discretion so thin as to be nearly transparent, and some with almost no pretense of concealment at all. His relationship with Alice Keppel lasted years and was understood by essentially everyone in their social circle. Alexandra responded to this situation with a strategy that historians have found both impressive and heartbreaking. She cultivated a public grace so complete and a private non-acknowledgement so total that she maintained her dignity across 47 years of marriage to a man who was consistently unfaithful. Her private correspondence, in the portions that have been examined by researchers, reveals that the grace cost her considerably more than it appeared to. The disturbing quality of Alexandra's wedding night is not dramatic or violent. It is institutional. She entered a marriage in which the terms had been set before she arrived, in which her beauty and her dignity were required and her feelings were optional, and in which the wedding ceremony was the most genuine thing that would happen to her in the entire marriage. Edward died on the 6th of May 1910, with Alice Keppel present at his deathbed, brought there at Alexandra's apparent direction, which is either a gesture of extraordinary magnanimity or the final act of a woman who had learned, over half a century, exactly what was expected of her. Using urine as mouthwash and teeth whitener. Before toothpaste, before mouthwash, before anyone thought to rub a minty leaf across their teeth and call it a day, the ancient Romans had a solution, and that solution was urine. Not their own, ideally. Collected urine, left to ferment in clay vessels on street corners, purchased by the jug and swished around the mouth like it was the finest thing available. And the genuinely unsettling part is that it worked. Urine contains ammonia, a compound that breaks down stains and kills bacteria well enough that the practice persisted for centuries across multiple cultures. Roman poet Catullus even mocked a man for having suspiciously white teeth, implying the brightness itself was proof of how much urine he was consuming. Portuguese urine was reportedly considered the most potent and was allegedly exported to Rome in sealed amphorae for the premium dental care market, though the primary sources for this specific trade detail are debated by historians. What is well documented is that the Roman Emperor Vespasian saw the demand for collected urine as a taxable commercial industry and levied a fee on its collection and sale, prompting the famous phrase, pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell. The practice wasn't confined to Rome either. Early modern European medical texts into the 17th century continued recommending urine-based rinses as legitimate dental advice from licensed physicians. The ammonia did the work. The smell was simply the price. Communal sponge on a stick. Roman public toilets, called phoracae, were some of the most advanced sanitation infrastructure the ancient world had ever produced, and they were also deeply, profoundly communal in a way that modern sensibilities find difficult to process. These were long stone benches with evenly spaced holes cut into them, running water beneath to carry waste away, and no dividers, no stalls, no privacy of any kind. Dozens of people sat side by side conducting their business while chatting, conducting transactions, and passing time together, because this was simply what going to the toilet meant. The cleaning implement shared between all of them was a xylospongium, a sea sponge fixed to a wooden or terracotta stick, sitting in a communal bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses. That was the sanitation protocol. Some of the larger latrines, including those excavated near the Palatine Hill, could seat 50 to 80 people simultaneously. Archaeologists have found that the drainage systems beneath these structures frequently suffered from pressure issues that pushed waste back up through the holes, meaning the environment was considerably worse than the gleaming marble implied. A parasitological study of Roman-era coprolites, preserved fecal matter, found evidence that intestinal parasites actually spread more widely in Roman urban populations than in pre-Roman ones, despite the infrastructure investment. The Romans built the pipes, they just shared the sponge. Bloodletting as universal medical treatment. For approximately 2,000 years, the most common medical procedure performed by trained physicians across the Western world was draining blood from sick patients, and it was applied to nearly every condition imaginable. Fevers, infections, broken bones, depression, headaches, and childbirth complications were all treated with bloodletting, based on the humoral theory developed by Hippocrates and later codified by the Roman physician Galen. The theory held that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness resulted from imbalances between them. Too much blood was almost always the diagnosis. Barber surgeons addressed this with lancets, with scarification, and with leeches, sometimes removing a pint or more of blood in a single session from patients who were already dangerously weakened. The commercial demand for leeches reached extraordinary levels. France alone was importing approximately 42 million leeches per year at the peak of the practice in the 1830s, stripping local wetlands of their populations and creating international leech trade routes. The most famous casualty of the practice was almost certainly George Washington, who in December 1799 developed a severe throat infection and was treated by his physicians with repeated bloodletting over a single day, reportedly losing close to 40% of his total blood volume before dying, though historians debate whether the infection or the treatment killed him faster. It was the French physician Pierre Louis who began dismantling the practice in the late 1820s by applying statistical analysis to patient outcomes and finding, with clinical detachment, that bled patients died at higher rates than those left alone, throwing waste out of windows. For much of the medieval and early modern period in European cities, the standard domestic waste disposal system was a chamber pot and an open window. Households collected their waste overnight in ceramic pots and in the morning simply opened the shutters and hurled the contents into the street below, ideally after shouting a warning to pedestrians. In Edinburgh's Old Town, this warning cry was Gardez-l'eau, derived from the French Gardez l'eau, watch out for the water, a phrase so commonly heard that it eventually filtered into English slang and, through a disputed but widely repeated etymological chain, may have contributed to the word loo as a term for the toilet. Edinburgh earned the nickname Auld Reekie, Old Smoky, from the perpetual stench rising from its streets, which functioned as open sewers for much of the year. Paris was no cleaner. The River Seine served simultaneously as the city's primary water source and its main waste dump, a situation that persisted well into the modern era and contributed to repeated cholera outbreaks. In this environment, rats thrived, and the conditions that allowed the Black Death to devastate European populations were significantly amplified by the waste-saturated streets of medieval cities. Someone had to clean it eventually, and that job fell to gong farmers, men employed specifically to empty cesspits and privies, permitted to work only at night, legally required to live outside city walls, and paid several times the wage of an ordinary laborer precisely because the work was so catastrophically unpleasant. Corpse medicine. Between approximately the 15th and 18th centuries, consuming human remains was not a fringe taboo in Europe. It was mainstream medicine, endorsed by trained physicians, sold in apothecaries, and consumed by royalty. The practice centered on a substance called mummia, originally derived from Egyptian mummies, but eventually extended to any processed human tissue. Ground human skull mixed into wine or chocolate was prescribed for epilepsy and headaches. Human fat, rendered from the bodies of executed criminals, was rubbed onto arthritic joints, wounds, and bruises. In Germany and several other European countries, Executioners were permitted to sell the fat of those they executed as a secondary commercial income, making the scaffold a place of multiple transactions. Warm blood, ideally fresh from an executed criminal, was consumed by crowds who pressed toward public executions, specifically to catch it in cups, a treatment considered effective for epilepsy. King Charles II of England reportedly consumed what were called the King's Drops, a preparation containing distilled human skull, as a daily tonic, a detail documented by scholar Richard Sugg in his academic study of the practice. The supply of Egyptian mummies was finite, and as it dwindled and as humoral medicine began to be replaced by more empirical approaches through the 18th century, corpse medicine faded, not immediately, and not because it scandalized people, but simply because the theoretical framework that justified it gradually collapsed. Lead in absolutely everything. The Romans' relationship with lead was one of history's most consequential unrecognized disasters. They used it in their plumbing, the word plumber comes directly from plumbum, the Latin word for lead, in their cooking vessels, their storage amphorae, their cosmetics, their paint, and most critically in their food and wine. Defrutum, a popular Roman condiment made by boiling down grape juice into a thick syrup, was prepared in lead pots, causing lead acetate to leach into the mixture during cooking. Lead acetate tastes sweet, which made it desirable as an additive and a preservative, and Roman cookbooks, including the collection attributed to Apicius, reference its use extensively. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, cognitive decline, irritability, fatigue, reproductive failure, erratic behavior, are strikingly well represented in the historical record of the Roman ruling class, and historian Jerome Neriagu proposed in a 1983 paper that widespread lead poisoning among the Roman aristocracy may have contributed to the empire's decline, a theory that remains debated but has not been dismissed. The problem wasn't confined to Rome. Elizabethan women achieved the fashionable pale complexion of the era using Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based cosmetic applied thickly across the face and neck, which caused skin damage, hair loss, and slow poisoning over years of use. Queen Elizabeth I's iconic white-painted face was almost certainly killing her incrementally. Victorian children played with lead-painted toys, slept beneath lead-painted walls, and ate sweets wrapped in lead foil, and none of it was considered alarming until the science caught up. Public executions as family entertainment. In London, Tyburn Tree, a triangular wooden gallows capable of hanging 24 people simultaneously, was the site of public executions that drew crowds estimated in the tens of thousands, with vendors selling food, pamphlets, and programs listing the condemned and their crimes. Execution days were public holidays in many jurisdictions, with workers given the day off to attend on the principle that witnessing justice would deter future crime. Families brought children. People secured viewing spots on rooftops and in windows of nearby buildings, sometimes paying for the privilege. The heads of executed traitors were displayed on London Bridge for years afterward, sometimes preserved in tar to slow decomposition, and tourists and residents alike treated them as notable sights worth pointing out. In Paris during the Revolutionary Terror, the Place de la Révolution became a regular venue for guillotine executions that attracted crowds with a festival atmosphere. Tricoteuses, women who sat in the front rows knitting while watching the blade fall, became iconic enough to be memorialized in art and literature. The guillotine had been designed specifically to make execution more humane and egalitarian, yet the spectacle it created was arguably more normalized than anything before it. The last public execution in England took place on May 26 of 1868, outside Newgate Prison, where Michael Barrett was hanged before a crowd estimated between 2,000 and 5,000. And the primary complaint from officials wasn't the crowd's presence, but its rowdiness. Grave robbing as a medical necessity. Until the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain, the only legal source of human bodies for medical dissection was executed murderers, a supply so small it was almost meaningless against the growing demand from expanding anatomy schools. The gap between supply and demand was filled by resurrection men, professional body snatchers who worked at night digging up fresh graves and selling the corpses to medical schools at prices equivalent to several weeks of an ordinary laborer's wages per body, somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 pounds per corpse by some accounts. Families of the recently deceased hired grave watchers constructed heavy iron cages called mort safes, bolted directly over burial sites, and commissioned specially designed stone slabs to deter digging, and some of these mortsafes are still visible in Scottish churchyards today. The trade was organized and occasionally corrupt, with gangs reportedly bribing gravediggers and hospital staff for information on recent deaths. William Burke and William Hare took the logic of the trade to its endpoint. Rather than waiting for people to die and then digging them up, they murdered 16 people in Edinburgh in 1828 and sold the fresh bodies directly to anatomist Robert Knox, who asked no questions. The public outrage from the Burke and Hare case was substantial enough to finally move Parliament, and the Anatomy Act of 1832 resolved the supply problem by allowing unclaimed bodies from workhouses to be used for dissection, transferring the burden, with grim efficiency, from the recently buried to the destitute living. Child labor in truly horrifying conditions. Chimney sweep boys as young as 4 or 5 years old were sent up into narrow brick flues, sometimes still warm from recent fires, to scrape soot from the interior walls with their bare hands and small brushes, their bodies being the primary tool for a job that adult bodies physically couldn't perform. Masters who trained climbing boys sometimes lit small fires beneath reluctant children to encourage upward movement. The boys developed a distinctive occupational disease, scrotal cancer from chronic soot exposure, described by surgeon Percival Pott in 1775, in one of the earliest documented cases of an occupationally caused cancer in medical history. In textile mills, children called scavengers were employed to crawl beneath running machinery to collect loose cotton from the floor, machinery that did not stop while they were underneath it. In coal mines, children as young as 5 worked as trappers, sitting alone in complete darkness for 12 or more hours, operating ventilation doors, a role documented in the 1842 Children's Employment Commission report. Factory owners preferred children for these roles because their size, compliance, and low wages made them economically ideal, and orphaned children from workhouses were transferred to factories under the legal fiction of apprenticeships that provided no meaningful training and no exit. The Factory Act of 1833 set a minimum working age of 9 for textile mills, considered a progressive reform at the time. Laudanum for everything, including babies. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold over the counter at pharmacies across Britain and America throughout the 19th century. No prescription required, at prices low enough that even the poorest urban families could afford it. It was prescribed for menstrual cramps, coughs, diarrhea, anxiety, insomnia, teething pain, and what physicians broadly classified as nervousness, which covered almost any complaint a woman might present with. Products marketed specifically for infants included Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained approximately 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce according to later analyses, and Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of opium and treacle sold to parents to quiet crying babies. Mrs. Winslow's was nicknamed the baby killer by some physicians even as it remained commercially available and heavily advertised. The largest demographic of laudanum users in Victorian Britain was middle and upper-class women, prescribed the drug freely by physicians for almost any complaint. The era's epidemic of female hysteria and nervous disorders was, in substantial part, medically administered opium addiction. Notable users included Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Florence Nightingale, among many prominent figures who consumed it regularly for years. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States finally began regulating opiates, marking the end of an era in which a bottle of morphine syrup for your teething infant sat on the same pharmacy shelf as headache powder and cough drops. The wandering womb and medical treatments for women. Ancient Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, believed the uterus was a semi-autonomous organ capable of detaching from its position and migrating through the body, pressing against other organs and causing illness wherever it settled. Almost any physical or emotional complaint in a woman could be attributed to this wandering organ. The word hysteria derives directly from hystera, the Greek word for uterus, and the diagnosis it produced persisted in Western medicine in various forms for over 2,000 years. Treatment in the ancient world included holding strong-smelling substances near the patient's face to repel the uterus downward, while placing pleasant scents near the genitals to attract it back into position. Victorian-era physicians inherited this general framework in updated form. Hysteria became the most commonly diagnosed condition in 19th-century women, and treatments ranged from forced rest cures and institutionalization to surgical removal of healthy ovaries. Surgeon Robert Batty formalized the removal of healthy ovaries as a treatment for behavioral and emotional conditions in 1872, a procedure that became common enough to be called normal ovariotomy and was performed thousands of times on women whose primary complaint was that they were distressed, difficult, or simply inconvenient. The claim that Victorian physicians routinely induced orgasm as a medical treatment for hysteria, popularized by Rachel Maines in her book The Technology of Orgasm, is contested by historians Hallie Lieberman and Eric Schatzberg, who argue the evidence does not support the broad version of the claim. What is not contested is that hysteria as a diagnosis remained in use well into the 20th century, and its full removal from diagnostic frameworks took until 1980. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.